Good morning and welcome to the sixth meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee in 2026. We have received apologies from Monica Lennon and unfortunately her substitute is unable to make it because of other commitments. Our first item of business is a decision on taking items 7, 8 and 9 in private. Item 7 is a consideration of today's evidence on the draft climate change plan. Item 8 is a consideration of today's evidence on the budget. And item 9 is a consideration of the committee's work programme. Are we agreed to take these in private? We are agreed. So our second item is an evidence session on 2 consent notifications relating to proposed UK statutory instruments, the Chemicals Health and Safety Amendment, Consequential and Transitional Provision Regulations 2026 and the REACH Amendment number 2 Regulations 2026. I would welcome to the meeting Gillian Martin, the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Action and Energy, and her supporting officials. There's Dan Merkel from the Chemicals Team Leader, Lucy Drummy, a lawyer, and Greg Walker, the Project Lead for Scottish Government. We'll take evidence on both instruments under this agenda item before discussing whether we are content for consent to be given under 2 separate agenda items, agendas 3 and 4. Cabinet Secretary, would you like to make a brief opening statement?
For inviting me to give evidence on the 2 UK statutory instruments, the Chemicals Health and Safety Amendment, Consequential and Transitional Provision Regulations 2026 and the REACH Amendment number 2 Regulations 2026. Chemical safety regulation within which the UK has inherited from the EU is very complex. It's organised around how chemicals are used, but as well as this sectoral approach, some regulations apply across the piece and introduce interdependencies between regulations. And because such legislation encompasses reserved and devolved competencies, Scottish ministers play a role in many aspects of decision-making within a common framework governance structure. Neither UK SI diminishes this role in the UK regulations that they amend. The first SI today, which I'll refer to as the HSE SI for brevity, concerns amendments to 3 separate pieces of chemical safety legislation that operate across Great Britain that the Health and Safety Executive, the HSE, has responsibility for on behalf of the Department of Work and Pensions. The details are contained in a notification that I submitted to the committee, but briefly these concern the classification, labelling and packaging, or CLP, regulation, which is about communicating the hazards of chemicals in the supply chain so that they can be transported, used and disposed of appropriately. The biocides regulation about the placing on the market and safe use of biocides, and the prior informed consent, which is also called PIC regulation, that controls the import and export of specific highly hazardous chemicals. And the HSE SI amends these 3 regulations in a number of ways that either improve efficiencies or address specific issues related to the resource required to operate them in a GB-only setting. The second instrument I'll refer to as the REACH SI concerns deadline by which companies must register their chemicals under the UK REACH regulation. Registration is a cornerstone of how UK REACH regulation works, and not only does it allow companies to demonstrate that chemicals can be used safely, it furnishes regulators with the information that they need to see what further controls might be required. But without this delay, we run the risk of GB businesses not being able to register under UK REACH, or at the least of companies incurring large needless costs, which I imagine none of us want. This is the second time the committee is scrutinising a proposal to postpone these transitional registration deadlines in UK REACH. This further extension of deadlines is essential to allow work to be completed on a longer-term fix for the issue, which is taking much longer than anticipated. This is due to its sheer complexity and the in-depth ongoing industry engagement on what is called Alternative Transitional Registration Model, the ATRM, and DEFRA is leading this work, but devolved governments, of course, that are involved in it. The HSE will maintain protections for people and the environment, support HSE's delivery of regulation, and in some cases should allow us to increase alignment with the EU. And for the UK REACH SI, companies supplying and using chemicals will still be adhering to the conditions laid down for the use under EU REACH. So any new chemicals introduced since Brexit need to be registered without delay under UK REACH, so are not in the scope of this instrument. And as such, I'm satisfied that we're maintaining standards set within the UK we're still in the EU with both these instruments. I'm happy, my officials and I, to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Just a quick question from me. As you say, we've looked at REACH before, and we're now looking at it again. I won't be here if it comes back a third time. Do you think it will come back a third time, or do you think this is the final nailing down of dates?
Well, I mean, my official will be able to instruct us to whether or not I suppose, reassurances we've had from the UK government on this. Obviously, if we're talking about the second amendment that I talked about, you know, I've obviously set out that there's a great deal of work that still needs to be done in that regard, and that's why there's been delays. It's something that I think that anyone who was here when we exited the EU, and certainly in this area of policy, we were always very concerned that any kind of arrangements for transition away from the EU REACH arrangements was going to be highly complex. Did we think it was going to take this amount of time? I don't think we could have even thought that it would have taken nearly up to 10 years to, but such as the REACH arrangements and having a mirroring system at UK level is we always knew it was going to be extremely complex. But I'm convinced that as long as the EU arrangements are in place up until the point in which we have a UK REACH system, that there's not any danger of any diminution of any standards associated with the chemicals.
I thank you for your reassurance. Didn't quite get to the point of whether we'll be doing another amendment on top. You said your officials might be able to give me confidence that this would be the final
one. When it
one.
comes down to it, is the UK government, but if my officials have any intelligence as to what they've said about when things might be coming back, then...
Thank you, Convener and Cabinet Secretary. Excuse me. Yeah, we're confident, I would say. We're confident it won't be back again. I think from our point of view, it would be unacceptable if it did, because EU REACH took just under a decade to implement their transitional registration arrangements. So I think going longer than the EU for a GB-only system isn't really acceptable. So we would be very keen that we don't see this again and that the alternative transitional registration model is in place as soon as possible.
Well, that may be some comfort to my successor, whoever that may be. Mark, I think you have some questions.
Yes, so I'm interested in where we are in terms of divergence with EU standards, how you're monitoring that, what are the main areas where we're starting to diverge from the EU?
Right, so the extension means that we won't have a comparable database until a year later. So this transitional phase that will continue to rely on conditions set out when we were still part of the EU. So the EU registrations database is still publicly available. It's still the resource for those outside of the UK looking for information on chemicals as well. So the HSE will not negatively impact alignment compared with the current situation. You're right to a certain extent that the HSE have asked for flexibility and discretion going forward. But well, for example, the CLP regulation is going to be implementing that internationally agreed system for classifying hazards there. So, and that's under the UN Environment Programme as well. So, at the moment, obviously, if there's flexibility required, I mean, I would. I mean, Mark, you know my views on this. I'd rather that we're still in the EU and we're still part of the EU REACH system, and you and I were on the same committee in the last term, where the concerns that you're bringing up now about any kind of like deviation from EU alignment was something that was a really very real risk, and will depend on I guess the flavour of government in the UK from one term to the next. But the HSE are the Health and Safety Executive, and they are the regulator in terms of, and I would expect that they take their duties and on the control of hazards associated with chemicals absolutely seriously. I would expect that there would be an intense mirroring of all the standards at EU level as much as possible. But, of course, it is going to be a UK system, and as you know, governed by the UK government of the day. So I think, you know, ENGOs are always right to point to the fact that, you know, by having a separate system, you know, you may have a UK government in the future that does not want to align with the EU. Certainly, the Scottish Government, we want to align as closely as possible with regulations in the UK, the EU and standards. But I'm satisfied as it stands that the flexibility that the HSE are asking for would be for very particular circumstances, and that they would have to get agreement from all governments in the UK in order for any deviation to happen. I don't know if my officials have got any further information on what's been set out by the HSE.
Yeah, maybe I could add to what the Cabinet Secretary says. It's just really complicated. So even things that should be easy to monitor, like reach restrictions, which we've talked about before in previous sessions, we've progressed 2 of those, whereas the EU have progressed 13. Excuse me again. But even with those 2, there are differences to what the EU have done, necessary differences that we've made. So even with something that should be easy to track, it's not straightforward. In the case of the HSE instrument here, to date, we've deviated on about 10% of the classification and labelling outcomes compared with the EU. And that's because in the current system, the HSE forms its own opinion on the same data that the EU have used to get to their classification. So most of the time we're agreeing, but not always. So this new system that we're putting in place, this fast-track system, should actually get rid of that deviation when we have straightforward, fairly simple cases.
Okay. So I think one of the areas of deviation is around hazard classes. Okay, so this is complicated, you're right, but can we just break it down to something that's quite simple to understand? Endocrine disruptor chemicals that are in children's toys. Now, my understanding is that the EU is banning those. They've put those in a hazard class, which means that they can't be sold. My understanding is that in this country, the view of the HSE regulators is that that's fine. We'll continue to sell toys with endocrine disruptors in this country. Is that an area of divergence? And how do you justify that?
The HSE's view is that hazard classes should be adopted at UN level before they're implemented domestically, and they've identified, this is, you know, they've told us that they've identified some problems with how the hazard classes are defined. So they are working at UN level to look at how these problems can be solved. In the particular example that you give, Mark, I'm afraid I don't have any particular detail on that, but that is their rationale that they've set out to us.
Okay. Can I ask then about the REACH amendments and the REACH regulations? I mean, the convener's already raised the fact that, you know, this has been back to Parliament 3 times already. I mean, is that an indication to you that this system is working? I mean, an 8-year delay in terms of implementation. It seems to me that this system is broken. It was set up as a Brexit fix, but it's been impossible to implement it. And I don't see where the data is coming from to actually get this functional and up and running.
I think it's fair to say that the HSE maybe haven't been publishing as much of the information that I think we would all like on this. Certainly, my officials have you know, we had that conversation about that. I think, as you rightly say, Mark, we are talking about decades of regulation at EU level that is having to be unpicked and a system built effectively from scratch in the UK. And the HSC are obviously taking their time to do that in a way that is robust and has the amount of resource and capacity on it that is required. We said, you know, 5 years ago how much of a task that was going to be, and I think that's been borne out by the fact that we're seeing delays to this because it is so complex building a new system at UK level that is replicating, as I say, decades of regulation. It used to be at EU level, and all the systems that used to lie at EU level as well.
Right. So you're saying give it another couple of years and it'll be fixed, or is HSE telling you it's fine, we've got it under control?
The
my understanding is not, industry doesn't know what it's meant to be collecting right now.
The HSC is saying, and my official can correct me if I'm wrong, that they need more time to bottom out all the work that has to be done associated with creating a new REACH system in the UK.
Which is what they've been saying since 2018.
Yeah.
Right.
Unsurprisingly, given
Yeah.
the task that they've had to undertake because of EU exit.
Okay. Can I just move on briefly? You know, there's a lot of focus here on HSE. I'm seeing a regulator that's also a policymaker. I'm seeing increasing responsibilities. Where does the Scottish Government sit in terms of HSE proposals? Because it looks like under the CLP regulation that the amount of time that the Scottish Government will have to actually respond to HSE proposals seems to be reduced.
Well, I think maybe you're referring to the notifications that have to go to ministers, and I can maybe address that. Is that we wouldn't have agreed to this if we thought there was going to be any diminution in standards associated with that. We're satisfied that the notification of ministers was actually not really an issue or a requirement that would make any material difference in terms of the standards that were going to be upheld by the HSE. Of course, what you're saying about the fact that the role of the HSE at UK level is really a question for the UK government. I mean, you know, if you're questioning whether the HSE has a number of roles that are in conflict with one another, I guess that's something that you'd have to take up with the UK government. But as somebody who, you know, on a personal level, I've worked when I worked in energy and had to adapt quite a lot of HSE protocols into courses for the oil and gas industry. I mean, they're a very well respected government agency with a great deal of expertise. I think the question is that are the HSC are they ready to, and do they have the capacity to take on the massive task as a result of regulation, as a result of EU exit? And that's a question for the UK government. But obviously they're requiring more time to get things right, and they are the body that are tasked with doing that by the UK government.
Okay, but you're obviously content. You're moving the motions here today. Yes, with everything the HSE is doing. Okay, can I just finally ask then, in terms of transparency with the HSE, I mean, this committee has not had a copy of the consultation summary and responses in relation to the CLP regulations. Have you?
We have had all the information that we need. I mean, we've seen, in terms of the consultation responses, that you're right, the HSC don't think, and they have not published that. Obviously, we have been going via DEFRA in particular to get all our questions answered about these statutory instruments.
So
they have said,
I'm a bit confused
one of the
as to who's leading on this. Is it DEFRA or is it HSE?
Well, the publication has been delayed. We've been assured that it's imminent and it will happen before the statutory instrument is laid. The draft text, my officials have seen the draft text of that. It's been shared during the drafting of the SI, but the final, the final publication has been delayed, you're right, but we've been assured that the HSE will publish that before it's considered at UK Parliament.
Okay, but we can't see it.
If they've not shared it with the committee and the committee's asked for that, then obviously the committee may want to take that up with them.
I don't think we've asked at all. I think that it came out as something that we discussed as a committee before the meeting, and Mark was concerned that this SI was being laid before the Health and Safety Executive had published consultation. Therefore, we weren't in a position really to ponder what came out of that. I think, if I've got that right, Mark, and I think my concern and the committee's concern would be that this SI has to be reported on, but without us seeing it or having the opportunity to see it. I think that's the point you're trying to make, is it not? So we haven't asked for it yet.
I think I'm finished, convener, just now. So.
Just looking around to see if
let other members come in.
Just looking around to see if any other committee member wants to ask any questions. Right, okay, we're going to move on to the next item, but before we do that, Cabinet Secretary, I'm going to thank you and your officials for the evidence that you've given, and I'm going to give you the opportunity to leave the table, as it were, while we make a decision on it, and then what will happen is, once we've made a decision on it, we'll briefly pause for 5 minutes and then go straight back into the next bit where you're on. So you can, well, no, I don't want you to leave. I'm offering you the opportunity, if you want to take a breath of fresh air while we discuss what we're going to do, because you won't, it's up to the committee with no input from you. So it's up to you if you want to stay put or move. So the third item of business is consideration of the proposal by the Scottish Government to consent to the UK Government legislating in a devolved area as set out by the UK statutory instrument proposal for the Chemicals Health and Safety Amendment Consequential and Transitional Provisions Regulations 2026. It's the committee's role to decide whether it agrees with the Scottish Government about the proposed change. We can express a view both on whether we agree in principle to the UK Government legislation in this area and whether we agree to the specific manner which it proposes to do so. If we are content for consent to be given, I can write to the Scottish Government accordingly. In writing to the Scottish Government, we also have the option of drawing matters to the Government's attention, pose questions, or ask to be kept up to date on particular matters. If the committee is not content with the proposal, however, can make one of several recommendations which have been outlined in the clerk's note. And I'm not going to go through those because they're there. I'm just going to ask members for their views on this. I guess, Mark, I'll come to you first because you've asked a few questions.
I mean, I think this is a mess. I think the UK REACH, process was set up 2018. I don't think it's ever worked. I appreciate the comments the Cabinet Secretary has made. This is a situation that Scotland doesn't want to find itself in with Brexit.
Going to be a bit pedantic, and I try desperately hard not to. This is on the chemical regulations rather than the next bit.
No, that's fine. I've got problems with both of them. So, I'll start with that one then. I mean, I've got concerns about the role with that one in relation to the HSE and their role. They are acting both as a regulator and a policy maker, and I see what feels a bit like a power grab. There's certainly a lack of transparency. We don't even have a consultation document in relation to that particular regulation. I'm concerned that decisions are being made without a lack of transparency. I don't know what alignment with wider UN rules actually means. I don't know if we're going to end up aligned with the regulatory regimes of other nations rather than the EU. And I think there are particular concerns around certain, classes of hazards, raise the issue of children's toys, endocrine disruptors. There may be other ones where we're effectively falling out of alignment with the EU. And that has serious implications. It has implications in terms of trade as well. So I am concerned. I don't think we've been presented with a full picture here. And I think the HSE, at the very least, should be in front of this committee to answer questions before we agree to such a far-reaching set of chemicals regulations that could take us further out of alignment with the EU.
Okay. I'm looking around other committee members. Bob, you would like to say something?
Just a brief observation, Convener. What I'm not sure about is, once these are approved, whether the die is cast forevermore, so to speak. This committee in another forum will, of course, be in place in a few months' time. This committee will have a legacy report. I also sit on the Social Justice Committee. We use an expression frequently in that committee called shared space. So as we're consenting to this is a shared space area for the successor committee. And if we do approve these, I'm not sure that means our ongoing scrutiny, notwithstanding the massive and voluminous work that this committee has under its current remit, whether there couldn't be an item of work, a breadcrumb in our legacy report about maybe getting HSE in at a later date to find out what these regulations mean in practice. I get for Mark Ruskell that means that's after we've given consent to it, and that's problematic for Mr Ruskell. I get that, but I'm just trying to think about how we take a responsible view here and follow through on some of the concerns Mark's raised in a future Parliament. So that may not be helpful in relation to this particular agenda item, but I'm trying to find a way forward, Convener.
Okay, Bob, I think it is helpful in the respect that we can certainly highlight that our concerns on this. But the problem is if we'll have to vote on this SI or make a decision on this SI today, which then binds, well, it allows the Scottish Government then to consent and for the, which I think has got to be done by somewhere around the 20th of February. I apologise if I haven't got the date quite right, but it's around there. So the UK government can decide on it and move forward. So it might well be that to help Mark's concerns, the HSE, it's a recommendation. This is further looked at by the subsequent committee and brought in. Does anyone, Kevin, I'm looking.
Thank you, Convener. None of these situations are ever ideal, and this is the difficulty with the devolved settlement and the difficulty of Brexit itself. I think, you know, I think all is fine in terms of getting the HSE to come in at a later point. We're not going to be able to do that in this term. There's just no way that that's happening with the level of work that this committee still has to do. And let's be honest, if the HSE consultation responses are only in a draft form, they may not be in full form before this Parliament breaks anyway. So what I would suggest, Convener, and I think we have got some comfort today in the fact that the Cabinet Secretary's officials have seen the draft consultation responses. I'm quite sure that if there was anything in those that was a red flag, they would have let the Cabinet Secretary know that that's the case. I think we need to trust the good offices of the Cabinet Secretary in this regard, and I'm sure that in moving today, the Cabinet Secretary could give us further assurance, which I think she has already, that the Government will continue to look at all of this, because we're not in the ideal position. Who wanted these changes? I certainly didn't, but we are where we are in the way that all of this operates.
Thank you, Kevin. That's helpful suggestion. So we could actually, when we make a decision on this, include a letter to the government saying our concerns about the HSE in the evidence session. But I mean, the difficulty is we do need to make a decision on the statutory instrument and giving approval or not. So, Mark, I'm trying to find a way where you might be content. I'm very happy if you're not going to be content.
That's been brought forward. So
okay, that's helpful because then we can just go straight to a decision. I'm afraid, as much as I dislike seeing the committee divided, I don't think there's any way around it. So I'm going to move the substantive question is the committee content that provisions set out in the notification should be made in the proposed UK statutory instrument? Are we all agreed?
No.
We are not agreed. Therefore, I just want to clarify, you're not going to agree to it at all, but are we going to be in a position to say that we're not agreed as a committee by one member objects, we'd have to say, and that we would like further details to be made available at a later date when the HSE has made made their consultation public to any subsequent committee. Would that be sufficient? I'm looking at the clerks. Okay, so I have to ask, are you objecting in principle, or would you rather the Scottish Government did it?
I'm objecting in principle to what is before the committee this morning.
Okay, I think that's clear, and that's the only member that... So we'll have to go to a vote, I'm afraid, as we're not agreed. So can I ask for those in favour to raise their hands, please? Those against to be raise their hands. Okay. So that is 5 votes for, 1 vote against. Therefore, it is agreed. But we'll make that point in the covering letter. So item 4 is consideration of the second proposal by the Scottish Government to consent to the UK Government legislating in a devolved area as set out in UK statutory instrument proposal for the REACH Amendment No. 2 Regulations 2026. As before, the committee's role is to decide whether it agrees with the Scottish Government about the proposed change. We can express a view both on whether we agree in principle to the UK Government legislation in this area and whether we agree to the specific mannerism which it's proposing to do. If we're content for consent to be given, I'll write to the Scottish Government accordingly. In writing, we have the option to draw matters to the Government's attention, pose questions, or ask to be kept up to date on particular matters. And there were options put forward in the clerk's note. Mark, I would like to just understand whether you're objecting to this one and whether you're objecting in principle or whether you'd be exactly the same.
Well, I mean, Convener, I think it's quite clear that this system is broken. You know, I've sat in this committee, I've sat in the predecessor committee as well, where we've granted extensions after extensions after extensions. I don't see the system ever working. I think it's important the UK Government thinks again about whether having a separate UK REACH database is actually ever going to get us to a point where we've got up-to-date data about public health and safety. I don't think we ever will get to that point. I mean, it's for the UK Government and other ministers around these islands to think about what the next system should be. Should we get to a point where in 2 years' time they can't meet that deadline and we're looking to extend it again? I don't know what that looks like. Perhaps they could align with the EU fully. Maybe they could take another approach. But I think right now we're in a position where there is an alternative but to continue to, you know, add another 2 years onto the deadline. But I want it noted that we have a completely and utterly dysfunctional system. It is not gathering the data. Industry doesn't know what kind of data it should be gathering right now. The whole system is broken, and I think there are serious concerns there that need to be raised with both governments going forward about the adequacy of the system. It is a joke right now, to be honest, to have an 8-year extension for something that was envisaged, I think, that was only going to take 2 years to replicate the database. So, you know, we're effectively being, you know, forced to vote for something which is redundant, inoperative, dysfunctional, and I'll do it through gritted teeth.
Okay. Okay. So we go to, yeah. Okay. So I hear what you're saying, but I'm going to have to ask a question on whether the committee is content that the provisions set out in the notification should be made in the proposed UK statutory instrument. Are we all agreed?
Agreed.
We are agreed. So we can be agreed on that, and we can write and express our concerns. I think that this is coming back. And what I would suggest that we'll draft up a letter, and Yes, and I think it's the clerk's raised a good point. I think it would be useful to copy that letter to the HSE so they understand our concerns about that. And I think I've also taken the point which we can come to before the end of this session about appointing the successor committee to this when it comes to it. So that's decided then. Good, thank you. Right, it's 9:15 now. Let's start again. We'll suspend the meeting briefly till 9:20 and then come straight back in at it. Thank you very much. Welcome back to this meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. Item 5 is an evidence session on the Scottish Government's draft climate change plan. This sets out how the Scottish Government intends to meet its carbon emission reduction targets. This committee is leading a cross-committee effort to scrutinise the draft plan, and the Scottish Government has said it will lay a final plan by the end of March. This will be our final evidence session on the plan, and we'll explore key themes identified throughout the committee's scrutiny and those raised by other committees. It's also an opportunity to explore the two main parts of the plan within the Cabinet Secretary's remit, energy supply and waste. I welcome back to the meeting Gillian Martin, the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Action. I also welcome her supporting officials, Philip Rains, the Deputy Director for Domestic Climate Change, and Edward McHardy, Economic Advisor for the Scottish Government. Thank you for attending this morning. And Cabinet Secretary, I think you're going to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to give evidence on the draft climate change plan, and I want to thank this committee and indeed the other committees for the tremendous amount of work that's been done in the scrutiny of the plan over previous months. I want to start bringing to the forefront why we're here. The draft climate change plan's got two key objectives: to provide a pathway for the Scottish Government to reach our greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, and to do so in a way that delivers our aspirations to improve the well-being and economic opportunities of the people of Scotland in a just way. We hear a lot about the costs of climate action, rightly, but we know that the potential benefits from climate action are significant. The benefits are wide-ranging, from low-carbon jobs that stakeholders in the offshore wind industry tell us about, stronger communities from improved public transport that equalities organisations have highlighted, improving our natural resources, our health and well-being through cleaner air, to warmer homes, helping tackle fuel poverty across the country. The Edinburgh Climate Change Institute at the University of Edinburgh estimate the value of these co-benefits for Scotland as totalling £6.3 billion over the period of the plan. And I suppose if you wanted to break that down, it would equate to around £1,150 per person in Scotland. It's also preventative spend for our public services, particularly our NHS, because the health benefits are significant. Reminding ourselves of the benefits is critical in how we bring people with us on this journey. I recently heard from community leaders in our climate action hubs about the importance of highlighting these benefits if we are to maintain public support for climate action. I fully agree. That's why I've sought to ensure that this features strongly in the draft climate change plan. It's also why today I'm reopening the Climate Engagement Fund to increase understanding of climate change and to empower people across Scotland to take action in their local communities. And here in Holyrood, I want to recognise that Parliament has worked in collaboration with Government to get to this stage. Since publishing the plan, I've met with MSPs across the Chamber to hear their views on our policy choices and priorities, the costs of climate action and the benefits, the massive benefits that it can bring. I've also been clear on the importance of hearing directly from our communities, and as such we've funded 5 partner organisations to act as trusted messengers within their communities to deliver further public engagement and make the consultation as active and inclusive as possible. These partners have delivered workshops and events to respond to the public consultation, reaching people the length and breadth of Scotland. At the same time, we've received over 500 responses to the public consultation, and it's my expectation that the independent analysis of these will be published very soon. In addition to the evidence the committee has heard, all of this feedback will improve the final plan. I'm grateful to all of those who have offered their views to the Scottish Government and to the committee's own public call for views. I'm under no illusions that the hardest part of our transition is ahead of us, but I also know that through the endeavour, skills and strength of our people, who are our biggest asset, that we can deliver on this. I must point out that while the Government will do all it can, the Scottish Government, some of those challenges are simply not within our gift to control, and that will shape what we want to do in the plan. The UK Government must move much faster, do more than key areas that are reserved to Westminster. I hope that all of us agree that we need urgent reform, not least on the price of electricity, a point that has been raised consistently by contributors to this committee. But I'm very grateful to be able to answer your questions today.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And I'd just like to put on record at the start of this, the committee is extremely grateful for the 8 other committees who fed in responses prior to today's session, some of them in draft, some of them are fuller. And of all of those committees have taken evidence and concentrated on the climate change plan, which I think shows a huge amount of interest and diligence in it. So I'd like to record our thanks for that. Cabinet Secretary, just help me, when you were drawing up this draft climate change plan, were each of the Cabinet Secretaries in their relevant briefs given their section and told to write it, or was it all written centrally and they signed it off?
No, it was collaboration from the get-go. It's been collaboration for years. It's not just happened in the last year. Effectively, we have a Cabinet subcommittee on climate change, and that is attended by key Cabinet Secretaries that have climate action embedded within their portfolio. Obviously, as you would expect, the Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands in the form of Mary Goujon, Fiona Hislop from Transport, Mary McCallan from Housing, but we also have the Finance Cabinet Secretary and the Deputy First Minister as part of that group as well. And effectively, we started with, I suppose, a blueprint, and obviously in my portfolio, I'm able to identify some of the actions that we can take within the climate action and energy portfolio. But actually, the bulk of the emissions reduction does actually come into land use and transport. So we're obviously able to look at the policies and commitments that have been made within those portfolios and have that as part of the blueprint, taking that into account. But we reach out to those Cabinet Secretaries and their officials to be able to, particularly when we got the advice from the Committee for Climate Change last February, can't remember exactly. It was May last year, thank you. And the carbon budgets were a key point in which we went back to those Cabinet Secretaries and those portfolios to see what more they could offer by way of emissions reduction to be able to meet the first carbon budget in particular and contribute further to the climate change plan. So it's not a case of we don't dictate to those portfolios what they should do. It is a conversation, it's collaboration absolutely across the whole of government.
Okay, so perfect. So when we look at Annex 3, my favourite part of the climate change plan, the Cabinet Secretary for Agriculture and Mr Fairley, her Minister, will have worked on pages 67 to 89 of that and will understand and be able to fill out all the facts and figures because they've worked on it from the beginning. I'm trying to work out, it's not down to the whole thing's not produced by you. It's down to each portfolio, Cabinet Secretary's portfolio.
It's a whole government approach. And obviously, as I said, those portfolios that are able to do a lot of the emissions reduction obviously have to reach out to their stakeholders, obviously have to look across all the other things that they have to achieve, and they have to make sure that the decisions that they're going to make are also in a just transition space as well. So it isn't quite just as simple as emissions reduction. They've got to take into account the impacts of the decisions that they're making and come back to that subcommittee, come back to discussions with me and my officials in the climate change plan, and we work through them as to what is possible and what might not be as desirable to do.
Okay, it's just I'm struggling when I look at it to understand because last week I particularly asked questions of the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, and she was unable to answer the questions on the figures in there, which we'll come to at a later stage in the section. But, you know, when you look at page 67 of Annex 3, it's accepted that all the figures are provisional because there aren't any details in there. So that would all be done, that would be Mary Goujon's fault rather than, or would it be attributable to her that they have to be provisional? Or are they attributable to you because you don't have the details? I'm trying to work out where the responsibility is.
Well, year on year, the responsibility for the action in portfolios is determined by the budget decisions, but obviously we'll be feeding back the policy that each Cabinet Secretary wanted to put forward to us in terms of emissions reduction. They would also have to take into consideration any government costs associated with that. So obviously we're not just talking about the costs, we're also talking about the cost benefits as well. So that's why we were working very closely with officials in those areas to be able to get their expertise in coming to not just the policy decisions and suggestions that they might make for the climate change plan, but the implications of how that would be delivered and indeed how it would be costed.
Okay, so what it says on page 67 is not being fully possible to assess the costs and benefits to the industry of all the elements of the policy package, so therefore it's provisional. Will they be tight in the final plan when it's laid in front of the Parliament?
The legislation, the Climate Change Act, asks us to set out an estimate of the costs and cost benefits. Therefore, it is always going to be an estimate. There are so many aspects to estimating the costs associated with all the actions associated with climate change. Some of them will be funding government policies and government initiatives. Others will lie in the investment space for private enterprise. And we actually set them out as a whole economy cost. We are not required by legislation, and indeed I would suggest that it would actually not be none of this is easy, but it would actually not be a task that could actually be fundamentally broken down into which element of the economy is going to have the benefits associated with action and which has got the costs associated with action. It's a whole economy cost. That's where the only country in the UK that has in legislation a requirement to estimate costs and cost benefits. The other nations in the UK don't have this. Whether they change and whether they adapt, I don't know. But we have set out our estimate on the whole economy cost and the whole economy benefits associated with the climate action that we have put into the plan. Some of it will be in government spend, but that is impossible for us to predict what that will be, as it will depend on year-to-year budgets and indeed what the programme for government is for the next however many years of the plan.
Okay, I'm sure we'll come back to costs at later in the session, but we've repeatedly heard on the evidence that we've heard that the draft climate change plan lacks specific detail and it's failing to deliver at the scale and pace required. How will you ensure the final climate change plan, when it's laid, is more clear and open about the specifics of who, what, when, where, how and at what cost? Because at the moment you're accepting the cost is a bit of a sort of stick your finger in the air and see where
Absolutely.
we go.
It's not stick your finger in the air. It is a whole economy cost that has been done. If I can maybe just set out, the climate change plan is an overarching document on emissions reduction. It's very wide in scope. It spans the whole economy and society. It's broken down across 7 sectors. There's a breadth of detailed sector and analytical information that's provided across annexes 2 and 3 of the plan. And there's 5 separate impact assessments that accompany it. We have heard through the consultation that a lot more detail can be set out on the how. And I think we absolutely take that on board. The final climate change plan, we want to be able to set out a lot about the delivery mechanisms that could be used in order to deliver on the aims of the plan. And that's going to be supported by sector-specific strategies and delivery plans as well. We've got 150 new policies, and we've also detailed continuing actions that would happen. We've got building on the achievements of the last climate change plan. We'll be analysing all the consultation responses. Detail and delivery is a theme that has been coming through from them. I've got the whole climate change plan here, and embedded within this, obviously, we've got the original, the front part of the plan. We've got annexes, and we have got links to many of the policies that are already in existence as well. I think it is actually very detailed, but we do take on board that people are asking for more detail on the delivery mechanisms associated with the plan. But as I've mentioned, it's an overarching plan. It has to be an overarching plan because we will have 3 different government sessions, parliamentary sessions, spanning the plan, and obviously the policies for those governments will be something that they will be setting out, with obviously the climate change plan in the background.
Okay, thank you. And I just gently at the beginning remind Cabinet Secretary, I think the committee wrote to you asking for any updates that came about as a result of the consultation, because we are particularly pushed for time, having to get our report completed before the end of February so that it can be debated in the Parliament in early March. And we asked for early sight, so I'm just reminding you that that letter's there. And also the fact that disappointing, I guess, is that we can't have a public session with the Climate Change Committee till after we've reported, but that's the way it is. Kevin, I think you've got some questions you want to ask.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. In your opening remarks, you said that there are obviously challenges in all of this, but you also highlighted opportunities. Professor Graham Roy, Chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, said, and I quote, "Not responding to the challenge of climate change will be far more expensive and damaging to the public finances than investing in net zero. It is simply not an option," end quote. But in all of this, you have the challenge of having to be able to deliver this plan, but you cannot shape some of the public policy or the resourcing for this, which rests with the UK government. So I want to concentrate on a few things here, which I think are extremely important, and you may want to add to them. You mentioned electricity prices. If there is not a change to the electricity pricing regime, the transmission regime, contract for difference, standing charges, and the list goes on, how much more difficult is it for the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, to reach our goals if the UK Government doesn't make those changes?
It's tremendously difficult. And it's tremendously difficult, particularly in a just transition context as well. So obviously we would like to have decarbonisation across industry and indeed across domestic life as much as possible. As you rightly say, that the reform of the electricity market that the UK, previous and current UK government said that they were going to undertake has not yielded anything by way of plans to bring down the costs of electricity. That's a piece of work that I was hopeful would come out with some kind of plan or solution associated with this. Because for example, if you are wanting to put in place policies which, for example, means that households will be able to make decisions on the type of heating that they have, which is not based on the burning of fossil fuels, whether it be the oil tank in your back garden, as many people in our area of the world still have, or whether it be natural gas in terms of a boiler. At the moment, if you were wanting to perhaps go to an electric solution, many people that you may be phoned up to ask for their advice on changing to an electric boiler would simply tell you, are you aware that you would be paying 4 times the amount of cost associated with running an electric boiler? You know, Scotland is at the moment around about 70% of renewable electricity being produced of the entire UK, but 70% of our needs in electricity. We have got plans to do an awful lot more. But rightly, communities are saying, where is the benefit to us of this? Why are we still paying the highest electricity costs in the whole of the UK? Why are the standing charges in the north of Scotland a great deal more than the standing charges in more populous parts of the UK, particularly the southeast of England? And they cannot connect the need to decarbonise with the cost of living. And the cost of living, as we know, as we all speak to our constituents, is the major issue for people right now. And until we see, I mean, one area that I find very disappointing that was taken off the table by the previous government and not brought back on by the current Labour government when they came into office, when they were looking at the reform of the electricity markets, was the false coupling of the price of gas with electricity. You know, this is an arrangement that is made. It is not actually based on real-world costs. It's an arrangement that means that gas is cheaper than electricity. And the electricity market should be separated from that of the gas market. And the more that we produce as a nation in Scotland, the lower the cost should be for the consumer.
So, as someone who has an all-electric house, I'm well aware of the costs of the bills. And while I would like to see others move in the same way as I've done, you know, it's very difficult to say to folk who are on their uppers that you should do this. So that's one challenge that, you know, in order for you to, for us to meet the climate change targets, we need that change at UK level. Can I move on to maybe another one? Because obviously, again, those of us from the North East have looked at carbon capture, the ACORN project. Within your draft plan, carbon capture features. What happens if that is not resourced by the UK government, if that does not become a reality? How difficult does that make it for us to achieve our targets here?
The advice given to all of the UK-based governments by the Climate Change Committee has factored in carbon capture and storage as being a fundamental need in order for Scotland to achieve net zero by 2045 and the UK to achieve net zero by 2050. This is baked into their modelling, that there will be negative emissions technologies and there will be carbon capture and storage in order particularly to allow industry to decarbonise. It's also a massive opportunity economically for Scotland in particular, and I'm not telling Mr Stewart anything that he doesn't know. We'll know that ACORN project, in the many guises we've had of a carbon capture and utilisation and storage industry and sector in the northeast of Scotland, has been something that's been worked on 15 plus years by many people, and the ACORN project in the Scottish cluster is fundamental to the plans associated with our net zero ambitions. We have had some movement in terms of some funding being pledged by the UK government to the ACORN project, but it is not of the significance that is required in order for the ACORN project to really get going. I mean, even recently we've seen carbon capture and storage monies given to other projects in the rest of the UK, which are not as well advanced as the ACORN project. But the big prize in terms of carbon capture and storage in Scotland is the size and capacity of the empty reservoirs in the North Sea, which used to hold natural gas and oil, that have now been depleted and have got the geological qualities that are perfect for the capture of carbon. And the capacity that we've got in Scotland and Scottish waters isn't just sufficient for the carbon that will be generated in the UK. They are large enough for it to be a sector that is able to import carbon for other parts of Europe that don't have that capacity. So it's actually a major economic opportunity as well. And in terms of a just transition, working carbon capture and storage for oil and gas workers and people that are skilled in the technologies associated with all of this it's an opportunity for a just transition as well. But the fundamental point in terms of the emissions and the capturing of the carbon associated it, when you speak to the Committee for Climate Change, I would be very interested to hear what they say about that, because it is baked into their modelling and it's baked into the carbon budgets that they have asked, well, they've recommended that we achieve. Thank you.
The third point, and you probably think I'm going to weigh on hydrogen as I normally would, but I'm not. I'm trying to tease this out in terms of the challenges there is for us, and obviously we all want us to deliver. But there are also challenges for the UK government in terms of them meeting their climate change targets. And in some regards, it might be more difficult for them in certain areas. Has there been discussion between the Scottish Government and the UK Government around about them changing some of the resourcing to help them meet the targets in the UK as a whole? So, for example, peatland restoration investment. You know, there's more peatland here in Scotland than there is elsewhere in the UK. Peatland restoration could do a huge amount in terms of reducing emissions. So helpful. Has there been discussion around about the UK government funding more of that, which would actually help them reach their climate change targets too?
That is a continual ask of the UK government. It's not just, you rightly point out the sequestration associated with peatland in terms of carbon sequestration, but also the work done to re-wet former peatland, because it is an emitter as well, is significant. Now, on the one hand, our ability to get to net zero by 2045 is as a result of the fact that we have the scale in terms of the peatland in order to sequester carbon and indeed stop the emissions associated with degraded peatland and the carbon capture that you mentioned before. We also have the tree planting and forestry, with 70% of the UK's tree planting has been done in Scotland. So Scotland is effectively punching above its weight in terms of the actions that we can take, but that is not reflected in the funding that comes from the UK government as regards their targets for 2050. So I think it's actually a very helpful argument, because, as I always say, UK government won't reach 2050 unless we reach net zero by 2045. But Scotland is doing a significant amount of the heavy lifting, particularly in carbon sequestration as well as emissions reduction, that I think that there's actually a very legitimate argument to be made that there is more spend given to the Scottish Government in order to be able to realise the potential in those areas, particularly in tree planting and in peatland restoration.
Very final point, and I served for a while in the Cabinet Subcommittee on climate change, and I think that there was a great degree of cooperation across government, which, by the sounds of it, is still the case. And that's grand. But do you think that that same level of cooperation, communication, collaboration exists between the devolved governments and the UK government in order for us to achieve those targets? Or do you think that, you know, part of the challenge that you face is maybe that there's not enough of that working together?
So I think we'd have to split that into two eras, I suppose, because engagement with the current UK government has been a lot better than it was with the previous governments in that regard, absolutely. However, is it at a surface level? I would say yes. Obviously, we have interministerial groups. They are probably, I'm trying to remember whether they're every quarterly or whether they're every 6 months, but certainly I've got one soon between the four governments. We have particularly, Wales, Northern Ireland and the Scottish governments have particularly pressed on actions around decarbonisation of the gas grid in particular. We have particularly pressed on action to do a lot of in electricity costs, and that's not just Scottish Government, but that's the Welsh Government and the Northern Irish Executive as well. We've been calling for a decision to be made on hydrogen blending in the gas grid. I mean, we have the potential to inject hydrogen, and that would be happening actually up in our area. The injections would happen at the facilities up in West Hill into the pipeline and the gas network. I mean, that would significantly two things. It would significantly reduce the emissions associated with natural gas that most people are using to heat their homes across the UK, so a significant emissions reduction for all of us. But it would also create a massive off-taker for hydrogen projects as well. So those are areas that I don't feel that we're going fast enough on. I feel that we're not getting the answers that we need from the UK Government on a lot of the potential that's sitting waiting for us to achieve. Is the engagement better than it was? Yes, it is. Is it at a deep enough level? Is it at a collaborative enough level that it needs to be? No, I would say there's a long way to go until we have that.
Okay. Thank you, Convener. I could ask lots of questions about hydrogen, but I know we're pushed for time. Thank you.
Well, maybe at the end there may be time. Who knows? Deputy Convener's next with his question. Michael.
Good morning. Some of the evidence received, witnesses have highlighted that the headline figures on emissions, costs and benefits, etc., in the draft report don't give sufficient detail. Can you maybe just explain to us how the government arrived at these figures? What did you use disaggregated figures in order to help to arrive at what appears to be an average in your emission figures?
Yes, and if you just forgive me while I get this in front of me, maybe if I could go to Phil Rains first of all, just to talk about the process that happened in government to actually arrive at the figures, and then I'll actually have some more detail.
So to be clear, Deputy Convener, is it the emissions? Because I guess there's emissions and their costs and there are different processes involved in getting both. So with regard to emissions, Teddy here might be able to back me up, I think, for some of the finer detail, but every set of policies will have an estimated set of emissions for it, some of which comes from our experience of knowing what it's like, I think, working through decarbonisation of heating systems, EVs and things what have you. So there's a well-understood analytical modelling basis for that. Where there's new policies, we've estimated what those emissions would be on the basis of the best knowledge available. So depending on what the policy area is, there'll be different methodologies involved. They're all brought together, and I imagine there's a wee bit of checking to make sure that there's no duplication of effort, the sort of things you might expect when you're compiling together that kind of emissions technical data across a range of policies. And then that produces the figures which are set out in the annex. I'll stop there because there may be specific detail. Yeah. Apologies,
and Phil's rightly pointed out that we always have to make sure that when we actually bring together the costs associated with anything, that we have to make sure that we're not double counting in any areas or we're not duplicating any work. So we've estimated a net cost of delivering the policies in the draft plan, and that's estimated to be £4.8 billion across the period of 2026 to 2040. And the way that was, the net figure was produced by deducting the estimated cost savings and financial benefits away from the estimated costs. The cost and benefit estimates were produced by analysts across the Scottish Government, and it was a whole government approach. It wasn't just the Climate Change Directorate. It was working with other policy officials, but it was also working with the financial portfolio as well, the finance portfolio, and was using methodologies that were consistent with the HM Treasury's Green Book guidance. So the figures that are presented in the plan, they represent the additional direct financial impacts of proposed policies. And that's relative to a sort of like status quo situation. As I say, there was 150 additional policies associated in this draft plan. But of course, there's the financing of existing policies as well that we're building on and that are actually going into, from this period of time, that are continuing. We're not dropping everything, all the existing work that's happening. We're building on the work that's happened as well. We also made sure that our assessment of costs and benefits were in line with the net costs kind of like projections as were worked out by the Scottish Funding Council, Scottish Fiscal Commission and the Committee for Climate Change. And we did that for the very reason of to avoid confusion. You know, we wanted to be consistent with them. Now, we're not consistent with the Committee for Climate Change in terms of the policies that they suggested that we might. So we obviously had to do quite a lot of work in terms of the different track that we had taken with regard particularly to livestock numbers. But those expected of distribution on cost and benefits is very difficult to lay out, first of all, but is also not required by the Climate Change Act. It is an estimate of the costs, a whole economy plan. It does not say a cost or a budget for government spending. That is not what is required. Indeed, that would be impossible because, as you know very, very well, every year you're deciding on the budget. And it's also not going to, it can't possibly take into account innovations in technologies. It can't take into account, it can only make an estimate based on market creation for particular innovations that would bring emissions reduction down as well. And of course, it doesn't take into account, it can't possibly take into account future direction that the UK government might take, which Kevin Stewart's helpfully set out.
It's encouraging to hear that there's been a lot of cross-directorate working in this matter in drawing together obviously the data and also in modelling how that would then look in different areas. Some of the evidence that we've received from witnesses has raised concerns about the presentation of the information within the draft plan. And I'm just going to give you a flavour of some of it. So from Lloyd Austin from Stop Climate Chaos, and I quote, it says, the draft plan unfortunately lacks the detail and the transparency that will allow us to reach any conclusion. We cannot tell how the modelling has been done, how the analysis has been led to the predicted emissions, reductions and so on. And then we had Dr Mark Winscoe from Edinburgh University in the UK Energy Research Centre. He says, I share many of the concerns about the way in which the plan has been presented and the fact that the evidence trail is not really there when it comes to the connections between analysis, the policy costs and the overall policy package and the efforts across different sectors. They're direct quotes that we've received from a couple of the witnesses. Given that you've clearly used disaggregated data to support you in your modelling for coming to what is the emission figures within it, will you publish the details of the modelling that you've undertaken to provide the transparency that some of the witnesses are saying is lacking?
I think it's a reasonable ask to have more information about the modelling. Absolutely. The disaggregated figures associated with it, I am not compelled to do that by the legislation, and it's an estimate, a whole economy cost. And there's very good reasons for that. Is because actually it's a moving picture. You know, the expected distribution, for example, you know, it's difficult at this stage to estimate the likely share that would fall to the Scottish Government without knowing, first of all, key elements of the UK Government's intentions and without being able to foresee where there will actually be market movements in terms of private investment and private sector market creation that will actually... So, for example, if you look at EVs, so EV charge points, which I know you know very well.
Cabinet, can I just check, just to be clear then, so you are prepared to provide publish the modelling that's associated with arriving at the emission figures?
I think that we'll take on board a lot of the discussion that's been had in that. I mean, Stop Climate Chaos.
Is there a reason why you would choose not to publish that data?
Because it's very difficult to put figures as to what a government might have to spend on the basis of not knowing what the UK government will do in some of the areas. For electricity costs, not knowing what the electricity cost is going to be in 5 years, 10 years. That's very, very difficult. So you can only ever give an estimate. And also decisions that we make in terms of policy where there's government interventions that we might decide that we want to make now because there's not been a market or there's not been private investment. And EV charging is a good example of that. If you look at the EV charging money that the Scottish Government put in the past and what has actually happened in terms of private investment in that, it's moved on significantly. So my worry about our modelling at the moment and setting out figures associated with that is that they might be out of date very, very quickly based on market movement, public sector investment and market creation, UK government interventions in key areas that have got a cost associated with them.
I think we understand that, you know, that things change. However, you've arrived at figures in the draft plan, and what we're asking for is a modelling and the data that you used in order to arrive at those figures. I understand that things will change and that policy options have an implication. What I don't understand is why we wouldn't publish the markings. Basically, you know, it's like at school when you did your maths, you had to show the workings and how you arrived at the answer. I don't understand why we wouldn't publish the modelling and the data that we used to inform the modelling outcome.
We'll take that away. The legislation does not compel us to give disaggregated data into the public domain. A lot of it is sensitive data. A lot of it could be misleading in that people may assume, and I'm not saying anyone in this room, but people out there may assume that the costs associated with something will fall to the government, where that actually might not be the case. And I think we know enough about some of the noises out with this Parliament at the moment who do not believe that the drive for net zero is a priority, should be a priority for any government, that may use some of that data in a misleading way in order to shake confidence in that. However, no other UK government has to produce their financial modelling or give cost estimates associated with the climate change plan. The reason we do is because an amendment got taken forward in the Climate Change Act that asked for an estimate on cost, and it was not a government cost. We also have the taxonomy associated with every budget as well.
Yeah, can I just on that before, I think taxonomy is going to come up at a slightly later point anyway in our questions. The issue of data potentially being misused as a reason for not publishing the data would actually, it happens all the time. You would publish very little if you thought it was potentially going to be misused. I'm a bit of a loss as to why we wouldn't publish the modelling data that was used to inform the figures that we've arrived at in our draft plan, so that people can see the workings that underpin how the government has arrived at that particular figure that's set out. And I think for transparency purposes and for the government, I think it would serve it well if it did publish the modelling and the data that informed that modelling exercise to arrive at the figures within the draft plan. And that's what the evidence we're receiving, that the committee's suggestion should happen.
Yeah, there are other consultation responses, including Stop Climate Chaos, who said that the costs and cost benefits were set out very well in the consultation, the response that we had. Phil, you wanted to come in with some additional information.
It's merely just to, I guess, set a level of expectation. It's, Deputy Gavini, to use your analogy, pupils might be asked to show their workings, but it would be perverse just to single out one pupil and other pupils not doing it. And what I mean by that analogy, the Climate Change Committee doesn't set out how it reaches its net cost by looking at gross versus other things. It's underneath the report it does that there is a massive methodological underpinning which is below the surface and which isn't transparent. The UK government doesn't do that. My understanding is we don't really set that out for the budget either. So you're right, there's always an argument for providing more and more information. But I guess the question is, if it's not required for these other things, if it's not expected of these other things, the question does arise is where does it add, I think, at this stage in terms of the consideration?
Well, I think it certainly adds if you can see the workings. I must confess, I find that argument quite bizarre. Nobody else does it, so we're not doing it. And it's not a case of, well, we don't do it. It's a case of, should you do it? So is the point. So I do find that quite a bizarre approach. Anyway, let me move on. Sorry.
Can I just say, I mean, you've raised some of the points that I raised earlier in this, is that we're asking people over the next 30-odd years to make, less than 30 years, 25 years, to make huge changes to their lifestyle and to make huge contributions towards the UK's ability to reach net zero by 2050 and Scotland by 2045. Therefore, to give them confidence in the plan which this government has laid forward, showing your workings would give them that confidence. Now, we used to have a saying, you know, scientifically wildly assessed guessed when it came to costs. I think there was another word that might have been assessed in there, but we can't see the workings. We don't understand them. And therefore, I think the point the Deputy Convener, it might not be required, but it gives credence to what you're trying to achieve. And that's the point
I understand that. I also want to point to some of the work that, again, has been challenging to ascertain the wider co-benefits and financial, the cost, what's called the cost benefits associated with this. And we have asked the Edinburgh Climate Change Institute to do some work on that. They've estimated that the financial benefits total 6.3 billion, but we have asked them to do additional work on modelling that to take that into account. I think this is an area of work that is extremely challenging for the real reasons that we've set out and does need an awful lot more work done. The fact that we have got this responsibility in statute to set out the costs and cost benefits associated with the climate change plan. And I think that this is the first climate change plan in which we have had to do this. It has been very challenging. Do we have to be more transparent about the modelling that we've used? Yeah, I take that on board. Do we need to do further work on the modelling associated with estimating the costs and cost benefits of something that won't just fall to government but will fall to a whole economy? Absolutely. Do the other governments that have an impact on our climate change plans, like the UK government, similarly have to do this work? I would suggest it would be very, very helpful, because then we could be looking at what is actually getting done at UK level to invest in climate action and what money is needed in order for us to get to net zero, both at UK level and at Scotland level. So absolutely, I'll take on board those criticisms. I've heard those criticisms. We are looking at what it is that we can actually put out to give more detail on that.
Okay. Bob, I know you want to come in. Just in closing, my comment is if you want somebody to sign up to a plan, they've got to understand the costs. That way they can buy into it. Bob, you want to come in, and then I'm going to come back to the Deputy Convener.
I was listening to that exchange, and I've got sympathy for what the Deputy Convener is saying, but we had a citizens panel on climate change. Sorry for the terminology wrong, Convener. We had that panel, and one of the things that they said was that if you just read everything about climate change in the newspapers and the media, it seemed like an insurmountable challenge, and they were very negative about it. But when they engaged with the actual practical things that were happening on the ground across Scotland, they were quite upbeat and positive about what was happening. So I get the nervousness, Convener, about additional detail and modelling work being provided, and let's be honest about it, certain individuals, certain groups and certain politicians will just look for any flaws they see in that modelling work to rip it to shreds, rather than to be fair-minded about it. That's not a reason not to publish it, but I can see a nervousness around that. So I think what I would say, Cabinet Secretary, there's a balance to be struck. And I would ask you to reflect on what more information you could give in relation to the modelling work, including where the uncertainties are. So, for example, in that modelling work, you may have a situation where you have to predicate what you think UK government investment will look like in certain areas. You don't have a clue, Cabinet Secretary, what that UK government investment is going to look like from one week to the next, let alone in 10, 15 years' time. So, if you are going to provide more information, and that would be welcome, Deputy Convener, I think you do have to think, Cabinet Secretary, carefully about what you provide to us. It's not a reason not to share it, but I think it is a reason to be a bit careful about how you share it and what fashion you share it, but it's not a reason not to do it. So actually reflect on those comments.
I think that's very helpful, Bob, because you've hit upon, I think the biggest thing that I'm concerned about is that it may be portrayed as being the government has to front up the whole of the costs associated with climate action, when in fact a lot of the proposals and policies within the climate change plan will create economic activity and investment that will actually overtake any kind of government action and will actually become a market that will drive down emissions but also create new sectors and economic growth as well. And also there needs to be an awful lot more work done on the estimate of preventative spend of climate action, in particular in the areas of health. Things like the air pollution associated with climate action and emissions reduction. The estimate at the moment is that UK-wide, the cost of air pollution to people's health is £27 billion and accounts for 30,000 deaths a year, according to the Royal College of Physicians. So there's lots of information, there's lots of analysis, there's lots of data out there, but it changes. And indeed, I think a fundamental thing that Mr Stewart pointed out is one of the inherent difficulties about arriving at a cost estimate associated with climate action is the cost of electricity. Because at the moment, it is very high. And we are told that it will come down in the future, but we don't know when and by how much. So there's a lot of this is all estimated. But I take on board your point, and I take on board everyone's point, including the Deputy Convener, is can we provide more about the modelling that we used in order to show how we arrived at that figure? I think we can. Do we have to be careful about what goes into the public domain about internal government processes in terms of arriving at this compulsion that we have within law to do this? I think that it has to come with a little bit of a health warning about how accurate those figures are and how accurate they will be going forward for a 15-year period.
Okay, thank you.
Just to come in on the back of that as well, a lot of what we need to consider when we're drafting the Analyst Annex is that this is a document to try and communicate a lot of detail to a public audience. And I know there's quite a lot of people who are very into the technical details of it, but trying to communicate all about quadruple the length of the Analyst Annex, and I don't think any member of the public would be going to read through that level of granularity.
Some members of the committee might.
Actually read the draft climate change plan at all, never mind the actual data. But I thought that the Cabinet Secretary gave a good illustration of actually, I think the issue is that in the health stats alone, there would have been a modelling process used for the purpose of arriving at those figures, and they would have used disaggregated data in order to achieve it. So that's the sort of data that's been asked for around how you've arrived at some of your headline figures in the draft climate change plan. The disaggregated data that was used and also the modelling that's been used in order to give substance to them, which we're looking for. Let me turn, though, to another point that's been raised with the committee, and that is some of the level of detail within the draft plan, because some of the sectoral emission levels have been reported in the plan, for example, on a policy basis. So you've got things like business, you've got industry, and then you've got areas where you have a higher level of reporting in areas such as buildings. What I'm trying to understand is what's the thinking behind having sort of broader areas such as business and industry as against areas which are more contained, such as buildings, and how do you intend to create the right type of oversight on these different levels of policy going forward?
Yeah, well, as you'll know, that emissions associated with, like, public and commercial buildings, it sits within my portfolio, but emissions associated with domestic buildings, obviously, is with Ms McKellen in terms of housing, and she's set out what she would like to do in the next Parliament associated with heating buildings and some of the areas of work that the government's looking into, particularly in compelling connection to heat networks as well. There's also there's cross-government, well, there's more cross-government work that I would like to do, particularly on things like private wire. So, again, we know the scale of the challenge associated with decarbonising Scotland's buildings, and we can estimate what that challenge looks like. But there are, in the solutions space, there's lots of different areas in which we would like some clarity. Right? So if I give you an example, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with, obviously we've got constrained wind payments for generation of electricity, and I think that's something that really exercises the public when they find out about this, that there's payments going to electricity generators not to produce because they can't get capacity on the grid. Why are we not incentivising diverting some of that electricity to areas which need decarbonisation? Why is there not an incentive to do that rather than to switch off and not generate? So that's one area that I want to look at with the UK government, particularly incentivising private wire supply to, for example, heat networks, which would decarbonise heat, particularly in urban areas. And would also, get away from this ridiculous situation where payments are being made for non-generation of this green electricity that we want to use. But of course, there's also the government Home Energy Scotland programmes that are out there, which are incentivising individual households to install heat systems like heat pumps, that will decarbonise their home heat. There's grants and there's loans available, and I know you know that very well. Do we want to say that this is all going to be paid for by government for people to do that? No, we would like to have a situation where the electricity cost comes down so that it becomes a choice for households that makes economic sense in order to install these low emissions systems as well. So that's where this discussion with the UK government is very, very important as well. As it stands, obviously, we have made an estimate on the amount of households that we believe to have high-emitting heat systems, and the scale of the challenge is worked out from that figure. And obviously, we're able to see how many households have access to Home Energy Scotland advice, but it's advice, and indeed have taken up the grants and loans associated with it, but it's nowhere near enough given the scale of the challenge. So we've got to look at a range of different interventions that can be made. I mentioned as well about the injection of hydrogen into the gas network as well. If the UK government were to make the decision, at the moment they're only talking about potentially 2%, but if they were to make the decision to what a lot of the experts say it can be done in terms of 10%, not only would we be taking down the emissions associated with people who have yet to move away from gas boilers into any kind of electric-based heating, and we were reducing the household emissions by 10% very quickly, as well as creating this industry for hydrogen and have a massive off-taker for that as well. So there's a lot of moving parts in the kind of decarbonising of buildings. We've set out a number of proposals associated with that, but obviously each government will decide on what their policies are. And of course, one of the frustrations that we had in putting together the climate change plan is that we didn't have any early sight on the Warmer Homes programme from the UK government, which has only just been published, and I would say is still lacking quite a lot of detail as well, because this is another area in which what the UK government is investing in this is going to make a material difference to our climate change plan.
Just going back to my point about the different approach you've taken on identifying emission levels, so policy areas like business, industry, and then specifically in in buildings. Has the analytical approach that you've used in order to arrive at the figures for these different sectors, is it the same analytical approach, or is it a different analytical approach that you've taken?
The same as what? Sorry, as the Committee for Climate Change?
No. So I asked you about, you've set out emission levels for broad policy areas such as business, industry, and then more specific policy areas such as housing. Has the analytical process that you've used in government in order to arrive at those different sectoral emission levels for those different policy areas the same?
Oh, for each sector?
Yeah.
Yeah. Phil, could you...
Well, I wonder if Teddy, as the analyst who probably did a lot of this work, might be able to answer that question.
Can I go to the analyst for this, so you get the level of detail, Mr. Matheson?
Yeah, so the divisions are sort of based on our interpretation of greenhouse gas inventory, on how we cut sort of big blocks of emissions as they report. But the methodology is specific to each area. We don't just apply a kind of rote process. In industry, we might be using a modelling system which is based sort of similar on the CCC's emission trading scheme model. Then in sort of buildings, we maybe have a sort of more specific policy where we sort of take our knowledge of the housing stock across Scotland and model into detail there. So, in the analytical annex, we kind of try and go into a bit of the detail of how we approach each area, but it is a sort of, it's an individual approach that each sector takes based on their best approach.
Okay, so and that makes sense. So because stuff in housing, there'll be specific aspects that you want to take into account as well within a Scottish dynamic. Which then brings me to the question of oversight of the figures on the targets. Do you then have a similar oversight mechanism to see what progress has been made on these different sectors in meeting their emission reduction levels? So you're using a slightly different analytical approach to arrive at the figure for them. What is the oversight mechanism to make sure they're making progress? Is that different, given the different nature of the analytical process you've used?
Yes, so there's a number of... Are you talking about government oversight of our progress?
Well, it is a government's plan, yeah.
So the government's obviously got a number of vehicles in which we actually check our progress, and obviously we need to report to Parliament every year on our progress as well. We also have the Cabinet Subcommittee, which I'm just trying to get. We've got the Climate Delivery Framework Oversight Group, which has Cabinet Secretary Finance, Transport, Climate Action, COSLA as Environment and Economy as spokesperson as well. We've got COSLA Vice Chair, we've got Cities Alliance representation on that as well. So obviously we work with local government in that. We've set up the Climate Intelligence Service in order to assist local government as well. They do an awful lot of the, I suppose, the advice on each sector and where the emissions occur and what work needs to be done as well. We've got the regular Cabinet Subcommittee on climate change as well. And also at director level, we've got the Director of Net Zero, who has oversight of all the portfolios, which actually, with the exception of housing, which sits in another portfolio, but obviously reports directly into that, on climate change, agriculture, transport, forestry, marine, rural economy, and energy as well. So those are government vehicles, and obviously Cabinet, more broadly, Cabinet as well, reporting on that. And of course to Parliament we have the regular updates that will be statements that we'll give to Parliament on the progress that's been made, that will be based on all the analysis that gets done in all of these areas, these internal mechanisms within government.
Okay, that's helpful, thanks.
I can add to that.
Sorry, I maybe missed one thing out. Phil wants to come in.
No, just maybe more. I don't know if the Deputy Convener would welcome maybe a more technical answer to some of that, but we regularly measure the emissions by sector, so we can do that. But one of the issues we have, which has been pointed out, I think, in the evidence, is that obviously when we collect emissions, it is quite a few years out of date. So the key thing there is the early indicators, is to get a sense from each sector, what are the things that would tell us whether we're on progress or not. And a good example of that might be, we know if we are able to decarbonize so many heating systems per year, what that might mean in terms of whether we're on track for emissions. So when the Cabinet Secretary talks about things like the Programme Board and the Cabinet Subcommittee, they'll be collecting all that data. We'd be presenting that to them to say, here's how we are for each sector, and this is what we think the, if you will, the sector's, how the sector is doing in terms of the emissions reduction by using these indicators as they go on.
If it's helpful to the committee, we could actually write with more detail on the modelling per sector, because I mean, I've got some very, I've got some details here in front of me, but they're actually probably not the detail that I think you're looking for. So
yeah,
we're happy to.
I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah,
that'd be helpful. Thanks.
Okay, good news at this stage. We're a quarter of the way through the questions that people said they wanted to ask, and we're over halfway through the time. So any help that anyone can give me in getting back on target would be useful. I'm going to move to Douglas now. I think you've got some questions.
And I'll be brief because I think Mark's going to ask something similar, Convener. So, Cabinet Secretary, in various sectors, the climate change plan diverges significantly from the modelled emissions of the Climate Change Committee. So can you describe some of the key areas where the Climate Change Committee and the Scottish Government modelling assumptions diverge, and why you chose to diverge in those areas?
Yes, and I just want to get some details in front of me about that, and it's particularly in the agriculture space. So very quickly, when we got the advice from the Committee for Climate Change, we have fundamental disagreement with the pathways associated with livestock numbers. Obviously, livestock produce a number of emissions, particularly difficult and potent greenhouse gases, particularly methane. So they have set out, they set out where they would like to see livestock emissions and suggest some policies around how that might happen. Now, we fundamentally disagree with anything that would impact the rural economy and impact agriculture in Scotland because of the significance of the sector to Scotland's economy and culture more generally. And you and I both know how important it is to the North East and by no means just the North East. Also, there were some things in there that made assumptions about Scotland's landscape and geography, which, with the greatest of respect, I don't think were really quite on the mark. For example, it was saying, like, we could reduce the number of sheep and we could be planting crops instead. Well, that doesn't work in a mountainous and difficult terrain to do planting like in the Highlands and islands. And, the convener is looking at me with a great deal of background knowledge on this. So that kind of landscape is suitable for sheep grazing, but you can't harvest crops from that area as well. So it made some assumptions there that I don't think were really based on Scotland's geography, with the greatest of respect to the Climate Change Committee, and I know that they do have the independent experts advising them. But the fundamental thing that we come back to was the just transition element of it, and also the great deal of work that Mary Goujon and Jim Fairley are doing with the sector in order to reduce emissions through other means, not in reducing livestock numbers, but by looking at some of the things that Mary Goujon went to the Rural Affairs Committee to talk about in relation to the climate change plan. So we think that the policy and proposals outlined by the draft plan present a realistic pathway to delivering the required emissions reduction to meet our first carbon budget. Agriculture emissions have already decreased by 13% since 1990. They've got a long way to go, but the decline is based on things like the use of fertilisers, the use of types of animal feed associated with emissions reduction in livestock, innovations around there might even be potential for capture of some of the emissions as well, technological advances. And we want to work with the industry in order to roll out the support through the whole farm plan and make sure that they are supported in terms of the knowledge sharing and indeed the farm payments to be able to do low emissions activities on farm. Some of it might be in the vehicle space, so we've done some work on non-road vehicles too, the use of biofuels. The work that Marie Goujon has been taken forward in terms of reviewing how farm payments are worked out will be less, will be more, I suppose, will be more than just yield and production and area. It will be a number of factors that will mean that farms get payments. So we think that's work that's ongoing and is much better in terms of a just transition, rather than any policies which deliberately reduced the amount of livestock. Another thing, and sorry, Fiona, I know that I'm going on at length, but another thing that is not calculated in the inventory around greenhouse gases domestically is there any potential for offshoring any of the policies that you put in place. So say a government was to put in policies that reduce the amount of beef herds. The country still eats beef. And it's better that it comes, in my view, that it comes locally and inputs into our economy. It has the standards that we expect in Scotland to be put into that the food chain, and also the air miles associated with importing food and importing beef that's from other countries like Argentina would be substantial. So effectively, in terms of the emission reduction, what you'd be doing is reducing the emissions associated with methane in Scotland, but you'd be offshoring them elsewhere, and I don't think that's a responsible thing to do.
Okay, thank you.
And because we mentioned agriculture, a subject close to my heart, I will remind the committee that I have an interest in a farm and a beef herd. Great beef it is too. And I'm not going to say any more than that and move straight on to Mark with your next questions.
Thanks for reminding us, Kavina. So it's about it's about a megaton of emissions. The choices that the government's made to not reduce livestock numbers and to not go for the recommended level of peatland restoration. So about a megaton a year. I think that's probably a conservative estimate. Where does that megaton get taken up then within the plan? Which other sectors are having to go further and faster to make up for that? So, I mean, Cabinet Secretary, you talked about the whole farm plan and, you know, making changes there. Are you suggesting that the megaton will be met within the agriculture sector itself, or is it other sectors that are going to take up the megaton? And what are those sectors going to have to do to up the ambition to go maybe beyond what the CCC think is possible or credible in order to make up for that amount of emissions?
So you have just set out the issue that was in front of us as soon as we decided that reducing livestock and having policies to reduce livestock numbers was a no-go area for the climate change plan. And that, so we effectively looked at what had to happen in terms of emissions reduction, and we reconvened all the cabinet secretaries who had the opportunity to produce and offer more policies in that area to make up for that decision. We obviously have CCUS was considered a non-emissions, negative emissions technologies as well in my portfolio. We looked at how much further we could go in that area. I was very clear in my officials that we wanted to look at areas in which there was potential for innovation and potential for growth in that area, in an economic space. And also, but the major portfolio, and my thanks goes to Ms Hislop for this in particular, Ms Hislop was able to come back with a raft of new policies that she had worked on with her transport officials, particularly in the ramping up of EV use, particularly in the additional support for more rapid rollout of EV charging, the EV Infrastructure Fund, 30 million. I know she went through all of this with you last week. They also looked at, we're looking at the issue of 24 additional public charge points by 2030, using non-domestic rates regime to further the net zero ambitions by introducing a relief for qualifying EV charging points for 10 years. She looked at transitioning to zero-emission heavy goods vehicles. That's an area in which there's actually quite a lot of movement happening already. But Ms Hislop was saying we could be in a position to accelerate this by government interventions and drawing in more commercial finance as a result of the work that the government's doing to really accelerate that. There was 800,000 put into the development of skills and heavy-duty vehicle decarbonisation as well.
So can I just, I'm sorry to intervene, but so there's a missing megaton. You're identifying some policies that have been identified that were accelerated and were improved upon, and there was greater ambition. Can you provide the figures on that? So to go back to Deputy Convener's point, you know, there is a need for a bit of transparency. We've got a clear implication for a policy change. There's been a conversation around the Cabinet. Other CABSECs have stepped up and said, you know what, we can provide a third of that through increasing rollout of HGVs or spending money here or investing in CCUS. Can we see where that megaton breaks down and the thinking there around, you know, the bidding process for CABSECs coming in saying, do you know what, we can make this work by increasing our ambition.
So, Phil,
here's what we're putting on the table in terms of carbon emissions.
The emissions associated with all the policies is in the plan already, but if you're specifically wanting us to take the additional policies at that point in time when we made that decision and provide you with what those policies, additional policies were from that point, and the emissions associated with it, that's something that we can give you. It's not set out in that way in the plan.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to see it in that way,
that would be great.
Maybe just to clarify, are you asking for where we differ from the Climate Change Committee? Because,
no, I'm not. That's my starting point for the question.
Because the policies that are set out in the plan take advice and consideration from a range of things, and they obviously set out the trajectories and things that are required.
That's not my question, but I think the CABSECs.
I think I know what you're asking for. So you're looking for effectively detail on what additional policies were brought in as a result of the decision we made on livestock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Douglas, are we back to you with a question?
We are back to me, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned when we're talking about beef that it's better that we produce locally than offshoring our emissions and supporting farmers in different countries. I guess the same applies for oil and gas, that it's better that we produce ourselves rather than rely on imports. Would that be right?
So, in terms of natural gas, the majority of, in the natural gas space, as long as we are using natural gas to be burnt, then that is obvious that having a supply of natural gas from our own resources would make most economic and energy security sense. The climate change plan is very much in the reduction of emissions associated with the workings of our society rather than the production aspect of energy. Because we were looking at the emissions associated with how we fuel our transport, how we fuel our heating, how we stop emissions going into the atmosphere, how we sequester carbon, etc., and how we bring them down in all those sectors of daily life that we rely upon. So in terms of production emissions, we obviously have no powers in terms of licensing for oil and gas projects, either exploration or production, at the Scottish level. At UK Government, we have asked and advised that the UK Government take a climate compatibility approach to future licensing. Now, but for Scotland's Scottish Government climate change plan, it is about the reduction of emissions associated with all of those aspects that we're looking to bring down. We're looking to bring them down. So only the production emissions associated with the recovery of oil and gas would really have any impact on the figures here, and they would be relatively small compared with all the other emissions associated with transport and heat.
So just to clarify, in terms of the climate change plan, it makes no difference, very small difference, to our emissions, whether we use our own oil and gas produced, I'm going to say produced in this country, rather than importing oil and gas. So
we haven't. I would say broadly yes, because it's a case of what fuel do you use for all these different parts of society, whether it's heating, whether it's transport. Is it electricity, which has no emissions associated with it, relatively small emissions associated with it, or is it the burning of fossil fuels? And it would be the inventory would be the same whether that fuel came from out with the UK or whether it came from within the UK. It's actually the usage of the fuel and the emissions associated with that that's actually in the inventory.
So we don't take any consideration into the fact that we're substituting potentially UK-produced gas with imported shale gas from the US with a far greater footprint. That's not taken into consideration because you're only considering the actual usage of it, not how it was produced and the carbon footprint of that gas.
So you say it's effectively the inventory associated with how you calculate the emissions, which you have to report on, is set out as being the domestic emissions that take place. And that comes back, you started off with the beef point. We can't factor in the emissions associated with importing beef from Argentina, because it's not actually, but we can factor in the emissions associated with beef that is reared in Scotland. So really the position on oil and gas in terms of anything to do with production is around the production emissions. Now, obviously, there is a drive, and many countries are doing this. Norway, in particular, are doing the lowering of their production emissions to avoid the use of diesel to keep platforms operating. That's why we have introduced the option of the INTOG licensing round, which would allow oil and gas production platforms to be coupled to floating offshore wind, or offshore wind in general, to be able to be taking a wire, so that the production emissions, which at the moment are largely diesel-based, obviously high-emitting, the production emissions come back. And I mean, there's obvious reasons for doing that, but one of the considerations that I think is important for oil and gas producers to make is they do this, they want to decarbonise their production as far as possible, in line with all other sectors as well, who want to decarbonise as far as possible.
So just to clarify, Cabinet Secretary, before I finish, because it seems strange that when we're looking at the climate change plan, our emissions, according to the plan, would be lower if we just imported oil and gas, because then that would take away all of our production emissions, because we're not taking that into consideration.
No, it's I don't really get the logic. The production emissions associated for oil and gas are actually quite small compared to all the emissions associated with heat and transport. It's about the burning of fossil fuels and other greenhouse gas emissions of a different nature. They are the things that need to be brought down in order for us to get to net zero. And no one is saying that it would be preferable to import anything, and it really doesn't have much of an impact on this climate change plan, where the sectors have been set out that have the highest emissions associated with them. And that is where we're making those interventions to bring down the emissions that will get us to net zero.
But we don't take into consideration the production from imported oil and gas, but we do from domestic.
So the way the
oil.
inventory, and this is not just, it's not just Scotland, it's not just UK, it's every single country has to report on their domestic emissions.
Yeah, and I think this is why some people will look at the climate change plan and lose confidence in a lot of the whole process, because we're almost turning a blind eye to production emissions when we're importing stuff. And or is that not the case?
So your issue seems to be with the calculations that are set out in the way in which all countries are asked to report on their own emissions. But of course, you make the point more generally. I don't necessarily agree with losing confidence in a climate change plan because of this issue. But you make the point more generally that one of the things, the context that you have to have, and the context that I certainly and my officials have, is we wouldn't want to do anything, even though it doesn't make a difference in terms of our calculations, we wouldn't want to do anything that offshored unnecessarily our emissions associated with agriculture. But that is not factored into our calculations, because that's not the way the inventory works. And it's not Scotland or the UK that decided on that inventory. It's, I mean, Phil, you'll know the detail of who exactly has set down how things are calculated, but it's a global framework that's there for the calculation of emissions domestically.
Maybe the simplest rule of thumb to think of is the goal of the climate change plan is to reduce the emissions in Scotland. That's what the law requires.
Yeah.
So that's why the plan has been designed that way. But the measures being taken have been designed in a way not to increase emissions around the rest of the world, not to offshore. So that's what the actions are. But it has to focus on the emissions in Scotland. And given that the production of oil and gas is not the biggest source of emission in and of itself, it's how that's used. Yeah. That's the critical thing. So there are very relevant points about climate change and about where oil and gas comes from. But the climate change plan may not be the place to capture all that because of the way the law requires the climate change plan to be done.
I mean, there's also an energy security aspect as well, is that the more that we reduce our reliance on the burning of fossil fuels for all aspects of our life, the more we are protected from global economic shocks. Now, you'll look at the situation that Germany was in, when overnight, because of the illegal invasion of Ukraine, they made a decision that they could not take Russian oil and gas as well. And the impact that that had on many European countries was severe, and they had to look to other sources there. But the best way to protect yourself is to be producing the green electricity at scale, producing hydrogen at scale, ramping up your efforts in terms of hydro, making sure that you have the storage associated with that electricity to be able to have as much energy security as possible. But at the same time, with all of those efforts, having the infrastructure built out to have the capacity for more electricity, which can displace the burning of fossil fuels. And we also have to take into account, sadly, that we know that peak oil and gas in the North Sea is decades away, behind us, and that in order to protect us against the energy security aspects of a decline in the production of oil and gas, we need to put mechanisms and replacements in place, and that's why there's such a drive for renewables in Scotland, and that's why we're doing so well comparatively to the rest of the UK.
So given for global emissions, it would be better if the UK produced as much of its own oil and gas as possible rather than rely on imports. should the Scottish Government's position on granting new oil and gas licences in the North Sea be changed to actually encourage those licensing to take place?
So that's not included. We're talking about the climate change plan here, and you have just given a summary that I don't necessarily agree with. I mean, I've explained the reason for protecting Scotland against global economic shocks, and I've explained the reason why production emissions don't feature particularly heavy in the climate change plan, because this is an emissions reduction plan that's associated with the heaviest emissions figures in Scottish society, and they lie in heat, land use and transport largely. And it is our job as a devolved government. We don't have responsibility for oil and gas licences, but we do have responsibility for emissions reduction in all those sectors, and that's where the climate change plan sets out our ideas on how we might do that.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Well, we're progressing well towards the target of the timescale, but not on reducing the amount of questions. But Bob, sorry, Kevin, you want to come in with a brief one, very brief.
Very briefly, and I think we're beginning to conflate a number of things here, and it is understandable because these are the kind of questions and discussions that were had in Aberdeen just a few weeks ago when the convener and I were there. I think what would be extremely useful, not only for the committee, but for others, is for us to get a better idea of the convention on how all of this is measured globally, to separate that from the areas of energy security and the areas that involve other environmental policy. And I wonder if that could be done in a very easy language way so that people can understand how all of this is calculated.
Certainly, we can, and also just with regard to any production emissions associated with oil and gas, that's in the UK's inventory as well, and that's another reason why it's not factored in the climate change plan. This is Scotland's climate change plan, reducing the emissions, but happy to set out how countries are asked to account for their emissions.
Thank you.
In a letter is even better, so that's great. So we move on to the next question, which I think is back to you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. So I wanted to ask you about negative emissions technology. I mean, it's a massive, massive part of the climate change plan. I think you're modelling that would be 12 megatons of carbon reduction as a result of nets. Now, that's double what the Climate Change Committee are recommending. They're recommending 6 megatons. And you just outlined how, actually, with some of the policy choices over livestock and peat and restoration, nets will be picking up some of that slack as well, although we'll find out exactly how much later on. Given where we are with Acorn at the moment, given the FEP plant at Mossmorran has now shut, given the refinery at Grangemouth has now shut, there are questions over where the emissions are going to go to make Acorn, where the emissions are coming from to make Acorn viable. What's your thinking on the viability of Acorn going forward? Is Acorn viable if Peterhead gas-fired power station doesn't feed into it?
So, first of all, Acorn wasn't predicated on 1 or 2 sites. Mm-hmm. Never. And all of the Scottish cluster was looking into areas, particularly hard to decarbonise areas about the whole of Scotland that may benefit from having CCUS. So it was never predicated on the closure of the untimely closure of some of the places that you mentioned. And forgive me, I am not going to talk about any plans that are potential for any. I think I can't do that, and I won't do that. Well, I would say, go back to your. So I think, first of all, I think Acorn is viable, and I don't just think Acorn is viable. I think it's absolutely necessary, and I think that if the UK government don't bring forward substantial funding for it, we're going to be missing a massive economic growth area in Scotland, as well as putting at jeopardy the UK climate change ambitions. More generally, it is one of the more mature projects of the whole of the UK, of all the projects, and it's also got the scale, and I mentioned that before, so I won't go over that again. You said that the Committee for Climate Change recommended, I think, half of what we've actually... They always said we could go further. They didn't say that that was the limit of the negative emissions technology. We've had those discussions with them, and they said that we could go further. If I could just explain how we arrived, we take a sort of bottom-up approach to NETS modelling. So we have had a lot of input from industry roundtables, academic research, companies already capturing CO2 in Scotland about where they could scale up, what more they could do. And the consensus was that 3.3 megatons per annum by 2040 was achievable. Stretching, but achievable. And the CCC used NETS to balance residual emissions from other sectors and fill in the gaps. But we're actively looking at this area as a real growth area of Scotland. There would actually be not so much taking just residual, but potentially providing a source of carbon capture, not just for Scotland's emissions and hard-to-abate sectors, but the whole of the UK and beyond, such as the capacity that we have. So we're going to set out our preferred route to NETS deployment later this year, and obviously election will happen, and the UK government haven't published their policies on NETS deployment, and so at the moment we're factoring in the fact that there's no funding associated necessarily we can count on from the UK government until we know what they're going to be setting out there. So we have to be factoring that in as well. To all our calculations. So we're going to publish this. So what I wanted to say is we're going to be publishing a route map to deployment of negative emissions technologies at scale by 2040. And that's one of the things in the area of work you talked about, is that we thought we can go further in negative emissions technologies.
Do you see the difficulty, though, in that there's such a reliance on this plan on NETS and by default Acorn? You can't answer questions about Peterhead Power Station because of the responsibility you've got as a government to consent or deny consent. But it's really hard to answer the question about whether that 12 megatons is viable or not without understanding whether Acorn is viable and without understanding whether Peterhead is absolutely critical to Acorn or not. So we're working... Cabinet Secretary, you're not offering a view on Peterhead, but I can't see how that would not have a major bearing on whether Acorn is viable going forward, and therefore whether a major part of your climate change plan is viable or not. And I appreciate the situation you're in, but is that not a bit of a conflict with government that you're presenting a climate change plan where you can't really present options because some of those are dependent on you as a consenting body?
The Committee for Climate Change, in their modelling and assumptions, have made an assumption that Acorn will go forward. I'm supportive of Acorn going forward. I think that Acorn is a necessity, but I also think it's a massive economic opportunity. And the Scottish Government will do all we can to advocate for Acorn at UK Government level for funding and provide funding where we can to accelerate the development of Acorn. It's long overdue. It should have been up and running. We all know the history of carbon capture and storage in the north east of Scotland. They've had the rug pulled from under them so many times. And the fact that we still have partners absolutely committed to this project is not only testament to their tenacity, but is testament to the potential that they see in this technology and all the businesses associated with it.
So it could go ahead without Peterhead gas-fired.
I'm not going to talk about Peterhead Power Station.
Right. So it could. Well, I'm kind of reading into it that it could go. There maybe is a route without Peterhead to Acorn being viable. Okay. We are where we are. Let's assume. let's imagine that Acorn doesn't get the go-ahead or isn't viable. Is there a plan B? Is there a contingency plan on this? Because if you remember, Climate Change Committee has been calling for years for government to have a contingency plan on this. Is there a contingency plan? I know you want to talk up Acorn, that's fine, I understand that, but let's imagine that it doesn't happen. Unimaginable, right? But it doesn't happen, what's a contingency plan?
So, if CCUS did not develop at the level at which the Committee for Climate Change has modelled their calculations, they would have to go back and provide additional advice on that, which we would look at. Because at the moment, and I said for successive pieces of advice going to both the UK and the Scottish Government, the Committee for Climate Change has factored in negative emissions technology and CCUS at scale.
Okay, but they have asked you to develop the contingency plan should Acorn not go ahead. So the questions come from the Climate Change Committee to you to develop the contingency plan. You're now saying, well, no, it's not up for us, it'd be up for the Climate Change Committee to develop that. Whose responsibility would it be?
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that if it's CCUS at the scale of Acorn weren't to happen, we would have to look to other sectors as to where we could make further emissions reduction. That's a position I would rather not be in.
Okay. So it would be back around the table with CabSex as well, chipping in as to what megatons they could contribute to the process.
But also, I mean, if CCUS doesn't happen at scale for the UK as a whole, then it wouldn't just be Scotland that would have to take another look at their climate change plan. It would be every part of the UK would have to take another look, and possibly their targets.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Maybe I
can ask
on the contingency planning.
Just want to say
one more question for 12.
Well, we're time up for this session, so we're going to go on. I'm going to push it on a little bit, but because we're halfway through the questions and other people have got questions, I want to kind of gently push you on. If I may, one final question, then I want to come to the Deputy Convener on waste issues.
Well, yeah,
So,
I was actually wanting
yes.
to just link them, Convener, into a question about energy from waste sites. And we don't have a lot of time to get into the detail on that, but there is an assumption that 45% of energy from waste sites will install CCS by 2032. Now, I'm assuming that's Acorn, that's carbon off-taking from energy from waste incinerators and going up to Acorn. But are there concerns about the ability to meet that reduction in carbon emissions, and how many megatons would that be that would have to be reconsidered if that doesn't happen by 2032?
There are smaller scale options of carbon capture and storage. I mean, they're already, we already have carbon capture in a number of small sites throughout Scotland. And obviously the Scottish cluster was brought together in order to look at emissions from a lot of, not just energy from waste, but from like concrete production, for example, and using the infrastructure, the pipeline infrastructure that's already throughout Scotland, of which some of it is not being used and could be repurposed. And that's actually the area of work that the Scottish Government's actually been working with the industry on, in actually, and indeed SGN in particular, looking at repurposing the infrastructure that's already there. Obviously, we want a Scottish cluster to exist. We want Acorn to go ahead, but there are smaller scale opportunities as well. Yeah. But at scale, we want it to happen with Acorn.
Okay, you're quite confident energy from waste. We can take 45% of those sites and push that to CCS by 2032.
I mean, in relative terms, the emissions associated from energy for waste is about 0.3 megatons, so relatively small compared to other areas as well.
Thanks. That's it.
Okay, Deputy Convener, over to you.
Just sticking with energy from waste, because the emission levels in the draft plan assume that they will peak this year, 2026. That appears to be built on some underlying assumptions from what I can see in the plan, which include that the landfill ban it would have already come into force and there's no new sites will come online. What levers do you have, Cabinet Secretary, to ensure that that we don't see an increase in energy from waste emissions this year?
So, at the moment, energy from waste capacity in Scotland was able to allow for the vast majority of waste carriers to not have to landfill. And we were able to go forward with the effective ban, but there are some small waste carriers that have not got places in the queue, haven't got contracts with energy for waste, because there's been a delay in some of the capacity being built, some of the new energy to waste plants that I think mainly as a result of inflation, some of it to do with Brexit as well, but they're due to come online this year and next year. So we actually know what the emissions are associated with energy from waste, and as I've just said, 0.3 megatons. And the levers that I've got available, so there's regulatory, in terms of I won't talk about my levers at the moment, but SEPA are working and have been very, very helpful in this, because we realised as the ban approached that smaller carriers who did not have the contracts with the existing energy for waste were in danger of them not having any way to get their waste dealt with other than landfill. So there's a temporary allowance from SEPA, from those carriers who've engaged with SEPA, to allow them to still put to landfill, but with a phased process of once energy from waste capacity becomes available. The larger waste carriers have actually been very helpful as well, and I've had a number of meetings with them in the run-up to the ban, where they were actually helping small carriers to consolidate their waste and sort of piggyback onto their contracts for the tonnage that would go into energy for waste. So they already had the contracts, and they were effectively allowing some smaller waste carriers to consolidate their waste and go through them as well. So that was a way in which they were able to help that situation as well. So a very, very small amount of waste still is going to landfill, but it's going to be tapered off, and it was to stop any kind of cliff edge that would have impacted these smaller businesses as well. The emissions associated with that obviously are very, very small, and we are really on track for all the waste going to energy for waste once these new facilities are up and running. And as you point out, beyond the point at which these facilities, that's us at capacity, that's us effectively got all the capacity in place for all the waste in Scotland to be dealt with, and there will be no need for any future planning applications. In fact, they won't be allowed.
Well, look, that seems a very pragmatic way of dealing with it for the small operators. What does that tapering timeline look like? And just so I'm clear in my mind, is the issue for some of these smaller operators, is it a lack of capacity in energy for waste facilities? Or is it they just haven't got contracts in place with energy
capacity?
So there is actually that these places they're full. So they just can't take their materials even if they wanted to enter into a contract with them.
They're full, and the ones that we are in the planning should have been operational by now, but for private financing reasons and inflation reasons and the cost of construction going up, as we've seen, they're taking a bit longer. But we have SEPA and obviously the Scottish Government have got a line of sight as to when they should be available, and that will make up for the shortfall. So the tapering is dependent upon these facilities being operational? We're really looking at it in the next couple of years. Okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Michael. I think we'll go to Bob next. Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. I'll try and be as brief as I can, given the time constraints. Cabinet Secretary, well, look briefly at some of the cross-committee scrutiny of the climate change plan. In particular, I want to look at identifying skills gaps and workforce planning that will be required. It was drawn to my attention that there was a climate energy skills action plan for 2020 through to 2025 with the then Climate Change Cabinet Secretary Rosanna Cunningham, believe it or not, back then at that point, and the Minister for Skills, which I think was Jamie Hepburn at the time. But there was quite a detailed route map around that, identifying the skills gap and how to address that. Is there similar work underway across government currently for this current iteration of these 5-year plans?
Yeah, there's a number of initiatives, and I worked very closely, particularly with Graham Day when he was Minister for Further Education on this, and you'll have seen the settlement that's been made in the budget for colleges and whatever. We are continuing programmes to invest in skills for net zero more broadly. We've got the Support for Energy Skills Partnership, ESP, has been absolutely instrumental in not only advising government on what is required and the analysis that they've been doing on skills gaps. So they're the sort of college sector agency for net zero and energy transition, and they've had a particular focus on energy, zero carbon transport, engineering, construction and wider STEM education. There's also been a reform of Scotland's post-school education skills system to make it more flexible and more adaptive to some of the industry requirements that have been made. As well, we've got the offshore wind skills priorities and action plan, and I was delighted to go with the First Minister for the opening of the North East Scotland College new offshore winds sector as well, which actually an area of it. I think it was a former warehouse that was used for oil and gas facilities. It was a dairy. There you go. That doesn't sound as good as my narrative, but it was a dairy. So basically, it was like full of pigeons and whatever, and it's now been transformed into this offshore winds skills hub. Crucially, it's not just for school leavers. It's for skilling up young people, but it's also for upskilling or reskilling people who are already in the workforce, perhaps in oil and gas mainly, and to be avoiding filling in the gaps that they have as well. So there's that centre there too. So we've got that Skills and Priorities Action Plan. I was in Edinburgh College a couple of weeks ago, and they are really leading on the skills associated with heat decarbonisation. Really leading. Cutting edge, and have partnerships with industry. And indeed, NESCOL have partnerships with industry as well in welding and creating we need a tremendous amount of welders associated with the deployment of ScotWind in particular. So you have companies working with colleges as well. So we're helping the colleges expand. Forth Valley College is another college that's been very instrumental in assisting in the closure of Grangemouth. We've given substantial pots of money for them to be able to work with those that are facing redundancy to upskill, reskill, even if it's just in the area of them being able to analyse the transferable skills that they already have in order to be able to apply for jobs as well. So there's a great deal of work going on at the moment. We've got the energy transition zone in Aberdeen as well. We've got work going on with universities as well, particularly Robert Gordon's University and Aberdeen University as well, to make sure that they have got the analysis that the government are getting, but also we're able to respond to their analysis about what they need in their areas as well to address any skills gaps.
I'm getting a sense you're over this in relation to your brief Cabinet Secretary. Thank you for putting that on the record. Can I just leave sitting without a response to this one? I'll ask my next question shortly. I was at Glasgow Kelvin College yesterday, and they're really enthused about the budget settlement. They also spoke about being able to move quickly to meet market demand in this area, and sometimes some short-term capital investment to allow them to grow and expand what they're doing as they pivot towards areas where there's businesses looking for that flexible approach to training and skills. To put that on the record, to say that it's really welcome, but there's a wee bit more to be done to get there, but there's a transition period for that sector, of course. Can I ask about what the Economy Committee has told us, and their very welcome scrutiny in relation to some of this stuff? They talk about a direct participative role for key groups such as trade unions, professional bodies and others. Maybe just a brief answer to that, Cabinet Secretary, if you can offer reassurances that they'll be part of the story rather than reacting to events.
So, well, first of all, we provide annual funding to the STUC to support just transition capacity. But if I can give you a direct example of what work with the unions has actually achieved in terms of just transition, as opposed with regards to Grangemouth, is that Unite the Union came to us with a jobs guarantee proposal in that we wanted to put in place a jobs guarantee for any business that was receiving government funding as a result of the work that we were doing there, that they would have first refusal in terms of interviews would be for those that were losing their jobs. And I think that that is potentially a blueprint for how we can do further work, and I'm very keen to work with the unions on that.
Okay, thanks, Cabinet Secretary. We've got from the Economy Committee where proactive co-production and co-design can be done rather
absolutely
than
essential.
unions reacting to a worrying period for some in relation to sustainability of jobs, but opportunities to create many more well-paid, fair work opportunities. Can I move on now to actually pick up a comment I think Edward McHardy made about we wouldn't want to have another 15 annexes to the climate change plan if we're talking to the Convener wanting to make sure ordinary people can understand it, and then Deputy Convener asking about all this disaggregated data. I suspect, as Mr Stewart said, very few people actually read the plan in the first place. I think it was Mr Stewart that said that. I'm sure his constituents have, though. Is there any chance, despite all this extra detail the committee is asking for, that we could get a slimmed down, jargon-free, accessible, practical, realistic, tangible plan that the public could engage with in a meaningful way? Because I think you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, Cabinet Secretary. You slim it down too much, we criticise you. You pad it out too much, we criticise you. It's about getting the balance right. But is there maybe multiple plans and versions to be more accessible?
Simple answer is yes. So we've got an easy to read version. We have a version that we put for young people and children. We have a Gaelic version, and they are. I mean, I think you're right. Some people want a lot more detail. Even the climate change hubs, I had a discussion with the climate change hubs, and they were saying that the climate change plan was too large, complex and detailed, and that they wanted something more accessible. We also were making the point that we're also having to respond to local authority climate change plans as well, so they felt a bit of overload. So making sure that the other thing Phil's just reminded me of, the way that we actually constructed the climate change plan is the reason why we wanted to make it accessible. One of the ways in which the large document accessible was by putting all the sectoral detail in the annexes, so that somebody who just wanted to have an overview of the climate change plan could read the first, part of it, the condensed summary of the climate change plan, and if you wanted that additional detail, you could go into the annexes.
Okay, thanks. I think the response is reasonable, but I think the points been well made by others about just making it accessible and tangible and meaningful to individuals.
I think it would be fair to say the evidence that the committee heard from young people on the version that was produced from them wasn't entirely in favour of what had been produced. There was a lot of comments that it might have been too simple and not enough detail in that. And that evidence was taken at various meetings that we've had with the Scottish Youth Parliament and also out with. So you'll be able to reflect on that, Cabinet Secretary.
Officials are engaging with the Youth Parliament as well on that.
Yeah, sorry, Bob.
I hate to incur the wrath of the Scottish Youth Parliament, but most young people will not be engaged with the Scottish Youth Parliament, and they want. Well, I think the Scottish Youth Parliament would also acknowledge that. I think we just need to make it accessible to all, and I commend the Scottish Youth Parliament for their scrutiny role in trying to represent young people, but there's a wider group out there who will just not want to be involved in any scrutiny. They'll just want to understand it and get it and make it meaningful to them. And I'll just leave that sitting.
Can I just say one thing? This point was made to me by the representatives that came into government for the Young People's Cabinet in the 2 years that I've been at that, and they wanted to have more, I suppose, resources put into schools. And as a result of that, I was in conversation with Jenny Gilruth about making sure that schools had all the availability of materials for working schools on climate action more generally.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think, some young people want to be all over the detail, some will just want a broad brushstroke summary, and it's making sure we don't lump them all together as the one group and we're successful. I wanted to mention Jen Pepper has established the Climate Cafe network across Scotland, and she and others gave some comments to the committee about making sure there was a local capacity within communities about being able to engage proactively and meaningfully about what climate change means for their communities in a way that can benefit them, where they can embrace it, but they want to make sure there was like enough long-term resource so they could, over the longer period, that community capacity could be built up. Are there any reflections in relation to that?
Yeah, so the Domestic Climate Change Resource Package in this year's budget has got a further £22 million investment and includes £6 million to continue that network of community climate action hubs and £1 million to support the Scottish Climate Intelligence Service as well that I mentioned. And we've just reopened today the Climate Engagement Fund. That's £275,000 to support activities such as things like climate festivals. So even if you're not involved in the great hubs that you've mentioned, there's a lot more that can be done in terms of training, showcasing clean technologies, all about increasing people's understanding of what action that they can take. And we have got a bit of analysis that the annual fund supported 24 projects from its launch in 2023 and has reached about 22,000 people since that. So hopefully that'll only increase. But I had a call with the climate hubs, and Jess Pepper was in that call as well. And that's where I was able to get feedback on their views on the climate change plan, but also views on what you just talked about before in terms of the accessibility and the capacity that people have to deal with something like this or not.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Final question, again, I'm reflecting the work of other committees, so thank you to the Citizens Participation Committee, Local Government Committee, who have made points around this final area, and that's about how we get evidenced community benefit correct when will the final climate change plan set out a clear approach to defining, delivering and evidencing community benefit from energy developments, including how community will be involved in co-designing and having direct, meaningful input into that rather than energy development come ahead, and if you like, there's a wee tack on community benefit to the end of it, and the community just kind of tick, we've done that bit, but they're actually proactively involved in a meaningful way. It's a more substantial benefit for communities.
It's a huge area of work. It's something that I really prioritise here. It's not going to be in the climate change plan because it's a separate piece of work on the good practice principles. There's two areas of work. So we have the voluntary good practice principles associated with community benefit in Scotland, which is advisory. And we like to think that developers sign up to that, but it is advisory because we don't have the powers in this area. But we have had some movement in terms of the UK government in terms of mandating community benefit and having principles associated with that in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which will now allow that for it to be mandated. So because I didn't want to wait on it being mandated because I didn't have success in convincing the previous government to mandate community benefit, we went ahead with the revision of our good practice principles. The consultation on that is closed, and I'm going to be, me and my officials are going to be doing a separate piece of work in refreshing the good practice principles, but also looking how we can embed some of the developments at UK level that now allow us to mandate levels of community benefit and the engagement they have with communities on that very thing. It won't be on the climate change plan because it won't be completed until after the climate change plan is. But also, it doesn't have an impact necessarily on emissions. So that's why it's not in the climate change plan.
Can I ask you to reflect on one final thing? And my apologies, I can't recall which witnesses gave this evidence, but there was a discussion at our committee when taking evidence around what community benefit looks like. So if there's a wind farm in very close proximity to one community, but there's a low-income community with significant deprivation not that far away, the community benefits can be hoovered up by the community in the closest proximity to the development. And we also spoke about offshore wind, particularly as floating technology is developed further, where it's hard to identify which community would benefit from that community benefit. And I'd also say, as an urban MSP, quite far away from a lot of this activity, we will still have large, low-income, high energy cost communities who would also like to benefit from Scotland's renewable revolution, which we all want to see. So just to reflect on how we can get community benefit right that doesn't create inequalities or inequity.
You have hit upon points that I discussed at length at the Citizens Participation Committee a few weeks ago. Okay. And that very issue came up, and actually there were some specific issues that were raised. Where good practice principles are for onshore technologies at the moment, offshore still to be developed. And you're right, it's complex, and we have to make sure that we have communities who will be concerned that they have got an impact on them directly from developments that want to see benefits. But at the same time, I take on board what you're saying about ones that maybe not in the line of sight, but want to be able to benefit more broadly from that.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Okay, Kevin, I think you've got a question.
Thank you, Aaron. Just a very quick one. Mr. Rains earlier on touched upon early warning indicators and just transition indicators, and the introduction of those are very welcome. However, how are you going to build a system, a dashboard, a public-facing system that makes sense to members of the public, makes sense to this Parliament, and how do we take the findings from all of that to make the adjustments and be as flexible as we can be in order to achieve targets?
I'll need to take that away in terms of a dashboard. That's not something that we've considered, because we've got the various ways in which we report on our progress. We report to Parliament on our progress. The monitoring approach for the CCP is going to build on that range of public scrutiny that's already there. We've got our annual monitoring report for the CP that goes out, and the assessment of progress towards implementing proposals. Also, I'm really pleased that you brought up the fact that we've got the monitoring indicators around just transition as well, and I was really pleased with the response we got from the Just Transition Commission on that. It was very, very welcome as well. 14 social, environmental and economic indicators, the first of their kind to be included in a Scottish climate change plan, and I'm very proud that we're able to do that. As far as a dashboard, can I take that away as a suggestion? We've got all the mechanisms that are laid out in statute in terms of our reporting, but if the committee is thinking that there's a need to have something more public-facing than that, that's something I'll obviously have to look into the resource implications of that as well.
So I don't think that this has to be particularly complicated, to be honest with you, Cabinet Secretary. The dashboard is not really something that has been discussed a huge amount at committee, but it's certainly featured in some of the public meetings that was in. And I think, you know, again, it's that simple scenario that folk know exactly what's going on. Something not complicated. And some of the things that you've mentioned where there is already reporting, I agree, that's good too. Yeah. But it's not the kind of thing that your average Joe and Josephine has got to take a look at.
I hear you.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, if there's no more, I've got a few quick-fire questions for you, Cabinet Secretary, just before we come to the end of this session. First of all, will the Parliament and the committee see a summary of the responses to the draft climate change plan before the debate that's going to be probably on the 5th of somewhere in the week, 3rd, 5th of March?
I'll need to get back to you on that.
Actually,
will we?
Confirm that.
Yeah, we can.
End of February is when the report will be coming forward.
I mean, I think
Phil's obviously got that organised.
Well, it would be helpful to get an early indication, if we could, before we produce our report. But the sooner the better.
Quite a surge in response. So we are
over 500 responses, but yeah. So Phil says that we've got it to give to you.
End of Feb.
Okay. I think it's been an interesting session. A lot of key questions from the committee regarding further explanation, more detailed costings and needing clarity. How will these be incorporated into the draft climate change plan when it becomes the climate change plan?
We will look at the committee report. we will obviously do our analysis of the responses, and obviously we'll be having, I would imagine, we'll be having a debate with all the committees reporting on that, and we will take all of it into consideration. I can say no more than that.
I think that the committee debate will probably be the first week in March, and you're not. My next question then is, you're not down to lay the climate change plan until the end of March. Are you still going to lay it before the end of this session? And will there be time for it to be debated in the Parliament when it moves from draft to full?
Time for debate in Parliament is for the Bureau, as you know. I have said throughout this entire process that it is my intention to lay the final draft, the final climate change plan, before the dissolution of Parliament.
And you, of course, would like to debate it, would you not, Cabinet Secretary?
I'll debate anything.
Perfect. So that's one signed up to that. And then the final thing is there's a lack of detail, or it appears a lack of detail, of a route map to net zero. You've claimed this morning a lot of that's down to movable parts. Are you going to attempt to produce one in the climate change plan to take into account the early warning indicators that Kevin Stewart just...
We have already identified that a lot of the responses have said that they'd like to see more delivery detail, and so we're going to take that forward.
Okay. Just before we end this session, I just want to put this on the record that the committee has engaged with the Climate Change Committee to try and take evidence from them. And they did offer a private session, which the committee felt, as a generality, the committee felt that if we were going to take evidence from them, it should be in public. And that public, sadly, evidence session now will not take place till the 3rd of March, which is after when we produced the report. And I'm saying, personally, I find that deeply unhelpful. I think it's also disrespectful to this committee, who is trying desperately hard to work to extremely tough deadlines with a huge workload if we can't take evidence before. And I hope, if nothing else, these comments will be reflected on by the Climate Change Committee, who I don't think have served this Parliament well by that decision. We are now going to take a 5-minute break before we move on to the next session. So I suspend the meeting for 5 minutes. Welcome back to this meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Commission. This is an evidence session with the Cabinet Secretary on the budget. And I'm not sure, was I giving the Cabinet Secretary a brief opening statement? Did you want to? You did want a brief opening statement. Cabinet Secretary, over to you.
Thank you. Always helpful to summarise before questions get asked. Grateful for the opportunity. Part of a much longer and wider process. I know the committee's already done a great deal in pre-budget scrutiny. It's important to set this conversation in the context of the Scottish Government's overall approach to this year's budget. First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government made clear the budget is focused on a fiscal programme that will deliver for the people of Scotland is balanced, sustainable and impactful. And our focus is to align government spending with the delivery of the 4 priorities of the government: eradicating child poverty, growing the economy, tackling the climate emergency and ensuring high quality and sustainable public services. The Scottish Government continues to face significant pressures that are out with our control: a constrained funding settlement from the UK Spending Review, rising costs across public services and demographic trends that increase demand for health and social care. Following the UK autumn budget, resource funding is only expected to grow by an average of 1.1% in real terms each year across the forecast period. For capital funding, which makes up the majority of my portfolio's requirement, the position is very challenging, with Scotland's capital block grant due to reduce in real terms by 0.3% per annum until 29-30. Nevertheless, the budget and the Scottish Spending Review protects and builds on the substantial investments that this government has already delivered for the people of Scotland. I'm proud that the 26-27 budget commits record funding of over £5 billion for activities that will have a positive impact on delivery of our climate change goals, including those to deliver on the potential of renewables, help tackle climate change, increase climate resilience and protect and restore nature. This underlines the importance cross-portfolio approach that we take when it comes to tackling the climate crisis, recognising that in reducing our emissions and mitigating the impacts of climate change, we have an unprecedented opportunity to build a more resilient and prosperous economy that's fit for the future. Action to minimise our country's contribution to global warming also brings with it innovations and systems change that can provide jobs, improve human and environmental health, reduce the cost of living, create energy and food security and position Scotland as an exporter of expertise. And as part of my portfolio, my portfolio will provide £436 million to support initiatives accelerating the transition to net zero, restoring nature and enabling communities and businesses to build resilience to climate impacts. It will do so while crucially unlocking responsible private investment and supporting skilled jobs across Scotland. The budget supports policy development and public engagement for climate change and adaptation. I've protected the funding to support climate action hubs, which involve communities directly, something I view as essential in our journey to net zero. We now have 24 active climate action hubs across Scotland, which have collectively held 781 training and learning events, reaching over 10,500 people, as well as providing non-financial support to 1,048 community groups. The £26 million for nature restoration stays at record levels of last year, keeping us on track to deliver the ambitions set out in the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy and Delivery Plan. And the activities in my portfolio to help tackle climate and nature emergencies have an impact on wider priorities of government, in particular growing our economy. The budget provides £93 million to maintain momentum in building critical offshore wind infrastructure and developing the supply chain, leveraging in significant private investment to maximise economic impact and create thousands more jobs. £16 million for the Just Transition Fund responds to the particular needs of the North East and Moray, delivering benefits for businesses, workers and communities, and will mean that we can continue to support initiatives like the Energy Transition Zone's Energy Transition Skills Hub, opened by the First Minister in September, and that is being delivered with £4.5 million of Scottish Government Just Transition funding, combined with ETZ's investment. I'm determined to secure Grangemouth's Just Transition, and the budget builds on the work that we've already announced, such as supporting the construction of Me Algae's new Omega-3 producing bioreactor at Grangemouth, which looks looks to create up to 130 direct jobs by 2029, and the £6.2 million of Scottish Government funding to support Celtic Renewables' new biorefinery project in Grangemouth will create up to 149 direct roles. I recognise the importance of our regulators, public bodies such as SEPA, keep us all safe from environmental harm, helping keep our air and water clean, alongside playing a pivotal role in providing flood warnings to families, businesses in Scotland and Nature Scot to make sure that we all flourish in Scotland's landscape. Thank you.
And your two officials, Cabinet Secretary, will be thinking I'm extremely rude for not introducing them, so let me do that now. Annabel Turpey is the Director in DG Net Zero, and Karen Thomas is the Head of Climate Action and Energy Portfolio Finance for the Scottish Government. Welcome to you both as well. And excuse my rudery. So my first question, Cabinet Secretary, it'll be a short one, like your opening statement. Tackling the climate emergency is classed as one of the 4 key priorities. However, the climate action and energy portfolio allocation in cash terms is flat in the spending review. Are you concerned?
I would always like more money. Every single Cabinet Secretary will say the same thing. We have to work within the constraints that we have and the settlement that we've been given. The spending review obviously doesn't replace the annual budget processes, where I will be negotiating with Cabinet colleagues on future budget settlements as well. I would point out, though, that some programmes that have previously been funded are coming to a natural end as well. So we've got the Recycling Improvement Fund comes to an end this year, and that's allocated £66 million to 48 projects. The Scottish Industrial Energy Transformation Fund ends with a focus shifting to development of the new industrial decarbonisation programme. And our investment to support the National Flood Resilience Strategy is concluded, and flood defence schemes are continuing to be funded through local government. So we're facing a very challenging fiscal environment. I, like every Cabinet Secretary, had to come forward with our priorities. I want to prioritise actions that are in the climate change plan to get us to deliver on that first carbon budget. And I think that the settlement that I've been given as part of the budget allows us to be able to do that. Certainly for the next year, there's a great deal of work that is going to be done in making sure that we reach that carbon budget. That said, I have had to make some very difficult decisions about some of the things that we can no longer support because of the fiscal settlement. Areas of work that were expected to have come to commercialisation by this point, like wave energy, has been given £72 million since 2014 and was expected to be at commercialisation by this point. It is of great regret to me that I wasn't able to fund them further, but I'm obviously discussing with them what might be able to be done in the future. I've had to make some very hard decisions, as has every single Cabinet Secretary, but I'm content that I'm able to carry on. I'm particularly pleased that I was able to protect the Nature Restoration Fund of £26 million, which means that that's 2 consecutive years in which it's been at that level, because what that actually delivers in terms of halting biodiversity loss is significant and important to the people of Scotland.
So in summary, you're saying hard but fair and you're not concerned?
I'm saying I would not like to have to cut things where I have, but I have had to prioritise certain actions which deliver on halting biodiversity loss and reducing emissions, and also supporting just transition for the north east of Moray and Grangemouth and Mossmorton. So delivering net zero in your portfolio, that's all on target with this budget? But I also have to recognise that it is around £5 billion across the whole of government in terms of climate action. Climate action doesn't just happen in this portfolio, and I was happy to support Mary Goujon, Mary McCallan and Fiona Hislop on their allocations that they've got, because they're going to be delivering significant emissions reduction. Okay, Kevin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Convener. Obviously, as you pointed out, it is always difficult balancing the books, but the just transition is something that is close to my heart and to yours in order to get it right, particularly for the north east of Scotland. Can the committee be assured that investment will continue in the north east to help a just transition? Can I ask if the UK government, if the Scottish government has continued to pressurise the UK government in this particular area? And is there the ability to be more flexible with that funding to maybe, for example, allow some revenue funding for community projects in particular, which can make a real difference not only in the shift to net zero, but also possibly in securing future job opportunities?
So the answer to all those questions, I think, is yes. In every year, I ask my officials to do an analysis on the Just Transition funding in terms of what it has been able to achieve, but also every year of it, certainly since I've had it in my portfolio, I have wanted to make sure that it's adaptable in terms of the types of projects that we've effectively focused it some years. In particular, in the last year, it was on skills and job creation in particular. We were able to help some companies invest in new equipment, which would allow them to go into different, pivot to different technologies and different sectors for their order books, particularly in the supply chain. Previous to that, we had a large focus on community action, like you've just said, and I was obviously able to look at the analysis on what had actually been funded. It's an area in which I want to be able to do more, because I appreciate that it's some of the actions that it delivers can be quite difficult to quantify in terms of just transition, but they have wider benefits. They have job creation associated, but they have community resilience as well, and the community resilience for the voluntary groups as well as reducing their carbon emissions and providing jobs and allowing them to pivot to different activities. So every year of the Just Transition Fund, I ask for that analysis, but we also look at the trends and the feedback from those areas into what's needed. Last year, it was skills gaps in particular that we focused on, because that's what we were hearing from people that had to be addressed, and we put a great deal of focus on having funding courses associated with reskilling and upskilling, and allowing training opportunities, as well as allowing companies to diversify so they can employ more people.
In terms of offshore wind, the ambition is to reach 40 gigawatts of new capacity in the next 15 years. What is the impact of reducing the budget to support the supply chain? Is there a way out of this? Do you think this is sending the right signals to companies? Which obviously will be somewhat frustrating for them, considering that they also have to put up with CFD and transmission charges and all of the rest in the mix. Is there a way that more support can be given, more comfort can be given in order to secure the future and jobs in that front?
So last year, because of the way the developments are going and CFD and auction rounds, that there was actually overcapacity in terms of the support that was given to supply chains, and all that money was spent. So we adjusted it, given the situation that we're in, and the need for supply chain support. There's still substantial support for supply chain, but it's a blend of capital and financial transactions as well. 93 million. We're going to take a commercial first approach. That's what we've done with all the supply chain money. When there's been a need for it, it's been when it's been deployed. So we've adjusted it. We've been able to make a small reduction this year, but in future years there may be more demand for it. So it's commercial first. We've been able to support like Kishon Port, for example, supply chain and ports. We've had private investment leveraged of 150 million on top of the monies that we've been given to supply chain. We've assisted Sumitomo to have their factory up and running. So it's really based on that commercial first. We're not going to put out money where it's not needed. We're going to want to be fleet of foot in actually getting that money to the point at which it's actually needed.
Briefly, because I know we're short of time. Does the fact that it's a combination of resourcing, including financial transactions, give you more flexibility to shift that money about if the commercial opportunities arise?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Oh, Annabelle would like to come in, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Just to clarify, it's been 150 million of Scottish Government money that has leveraged in 670 million of private investment. Yeah, no, I thought you would want that corrected, CabSec. and to note that, you know, as we see across the portfolio, what we are really focused on is how do we make our money work as hard as it can. Yeah. So it's private sector investment, it's getting it out to communities, that flexibility you talked about, Mr Stewart, but it's also how we can work with the UK Government in quite a complicated, reserved, devolved area to make sure that the UK Government we're leveraging funding for Scotland.
We're able to track the money that, I mean, Just Transition funding money and offshore wind money. We are actually able to track where there has been inward investment as a result, but also our SDI activities as well. If I take the government's, the 3 ministers that went to the Osaka Expo, we've actually been able to quantify that there's 23 million of inward investment coming into Scotland as a result of those 3 interventions. So we're always able to track where we can track where that investment from Scottish Government money actually leads to greater investment from private sector.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, Douglas, I think the next question is yours.
Come in briefly, Convener. The 500 million for North East and Moray, the transition funding. So I think we're almost halfway through that 10-year period. Can you just clarify how much has been spent or committed of that 500 million in the so far?
I need to get the exact figures. I think it's just under 100 million at that point, but my...
83.5 million.
So 83 million.
So there's a lot more that needs to be done, and obviously the fiscal situation that we're in has made it difficult to be able to deploy as much money as was set out by previous First Ministers who made that commitment. So Kevin Stewart made the point that we need to look to where we can to get assistance from the UK Government in terms of Just Transition as well. But you're right, it's something that we are committed to, that Just Transition Fund, but the fiscal settlement has made that very difficult.
So you're still confident we'll get to that 500 million figure within the 10-year period?
I would like to be able to deploy that, yes, of course I would.
But it seems strange that we're only 20% through that figure and we're almost halfway through the timescale.
That is a reflection on the fiscal difficulties that we have right now.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Oh, that was a bit quicker than I anticipated. Michael, do you have a question?
Yeah, can I just think, what was the rationale behind ending funding for Wave Energy Scotland?
Right, so very regrettable, and I wished I didn't have to make decisions like that, but and we are in discussion with Wave Energy Scotland around this. Wave Energy Scotland was expected to be at commercialisation by this point, and they still have an ask of government. I was unable to provide them with that in this budget. Obviously, I had to come to Cabinet with areas that were prioritised and the areas that sadly couldn't be prioritised. So the rationale really is around the constraints that I've been under to deliver. The Finance Secretary has asked every Cabinet Secretary on. I would like to be able to find a way to support them. I have to say that GB Energy should be assisting in technologies that are yet to achieve commercialisation. I feel this very strongly. GB Energy seem to be going after technologies that are already commercial, when it's the ones that have potential like Wave and Tidal that need government assistance. And I have made this point to the Energy Minister at UK government level, and I've made this point in public about where they could be able to assist the Scottish Government and assist some of these technologies in getting commerciality. They also have, I do believe that they have to be, the UK Government also have to be looking at why these technologies aren't getting to commercialisation, and if there had to be favourable conditions for them, because they do need assistance. It is regrettable that I was not able to put any funding towards Wave Energy Scotland, but I'm afraid that I was in a very difficult position.
So my understanding is that they were looking for about £3.08 million over the next 2 financial years, 1.7 million this year and 1.3 million next year. Given what appears to be a very, very small amount of the £436 million in your budget, the consequence of this, from what we've been told, is that obviously Wave Energy Scotland, which we set up, Scottish Government set up in 2014, will be closed down with 10 full-time equivalent jobs lost. Motion Energy, a company that's based in Edinburgh, has basically said that they will have to close down with 13 direct jobs being lost. What do you think that this cut, what message that sends out about our ambition on marine energy in general, if we are quite literally pulling the plug on what are two of the key parts of trying to deliver Wave Energy?
Officials have been working with Wave Energy Scotland to get an awful lot more clarity around future planning to get them to commercialisation. And that has been happening since September 2024. My officials advised that the Scottish Government put forward a budget proposal for limited funding, but we're clear that we couldn't, it would have to be contingent on budget affordability. Those conversations will be continuing because we need to see a plan, a business plan from them that shows how they can get to commercialisation. And we haven't had the clarity on how they're going to do that. I don't want to cut anything. I don't want to be in a position where I have to make these decisions. I had to make some very hard decisions around this about what we could prioritise. But we are still talking to Wave Energy Scotland about future funding options.
So I think from what they've said to us is that given that the funding ends next month, is that they have to start giving people statutory notice now. So, and I'm not sure whether what the timescale is now for the conclusion of the discussions with Wave Energy Scotland, but it would appear that if it's not resolved, I would have thought, in the very, very near future, then it will be lost. Now, I don't know, Cabinet Secretary, are you saying that funding would be in the future is contingent, for next financial year, is contingent on having a business case and a business plan that satisfies you?
They have to be able to set out a business plan that takes them to commercialisation. But my officials are speaking to Wave Energy Scotland, and obviously if there's anything that can be done to stop what you have just outlined, then I want to be able to figure out if we can support them. But I can't say any more than that because those discussions are still happening.
Okay. Do you know when you'd expect them to be concluded? Because they're basically saying we're going to have to lay folk off now.
Yeah.
So
Wave Energy Scotland,
because the money, there's no tailing off of the money. It just ends at the end of March.
I'm not going to commit to anything without speaking to my officials on the latest situation and the latest discussions they've had with Wave Energy Scotland.
Okay, it'd be really helpful if you could keep the committee up to date in that matter, just given the correspondence we've received from them and the sector. My second question or area is on the issue of the energy transition budget, which sees a 45% reduction in its budget going into the next financial year. Can you maybe advise us where that 45% reduction is being secured from?
So the 48.2 energy transition budget is obviously capital and resource, and it's supporting that shift. Some of the projects that I mentioned that were coming to a natural end are a result of that decrease. The Recycling Improvement Fund I mentioned, the Scottish Industrial Energy Transformation Fund is ending, as well as the investment to support the launch of the National Flood Resilience. So the budget has been reconfigured to projects that were taken forward and other existing projects that are continuing. So that's why there's a decrease there. So we were able to fund everything that we were able to that we committed to in the programme for government. But obviously, because these other projects were coming to an end, that was the reason for that reduction.
Okay, so that's all associated with projects coming to an end at 45% reduction.
Whether it's all associated with that, I would need to go to Karen.
So that budget covers a range of different programmes. There is some reduction beyond. So there's basically the projects that are coming to an end. Forgive me till I find the right set of figures.
Maybe it also would be helpful to mention some of the things that we are funding in that space, which is new. So obviously there was a £15 million package of funding for Mialgie to be able to build their site in the Grangemouth industrial complex, and to Celtic Renewables as well. And obviously we're doing a great deal of work on good practice principles to put things in place for more community benefits for communities as well. So a lot of the work that's been done in that is actually in the space of transition to economic shocks that we've faced.
Sorry, I think Karen was going to give us the details of what the breakdown is of the 45% reduction.
So the 45% reduction is predominantly made up of the Scottish Energy Transition Fund, Innovation Transition Fund coming to an end, which was £4.5 million, ETF, which was £6 million, and hydrogen investment of £10.5 million. So those were coming to a natural conclusion. There's continued investment in Grangemouth to the extent of £15 million within that budget line. Those transition funds are moving into the new space of the industrial decarbonisation strategy, which is being in development alongside the carbon climate change plan.
They're also being used for the funding of CARES, for communities to have more access to the expertise and the capital associated that they might need for community energy. And you'll have noticed, although it's not so much in the budget space, that we have given a pilot programme for repowering opportunities that are happening in forestry land Scotland, for communities to have an option to have them first.
Thanks. Can I turn, and my final area is in relation to the Energy Consent Unit and funding of the energy and resourcing of the Energy Consent Unit. It clearly remains within the Energy Transition budget line.
Yes.
However, ministerial responsibilities moved to the Minister for Public Finance.
Yes.
So it's just to understand the rationale for that, and to ask you whether you are satisfied that the ECU has sufficient resource to meet the demand that it's facing. Alongside that, the statutory consultees, such as Nature Scot, etc., that they have the resources available to them in order to meet the increasing demand which they're facing, in order to ensure the timely discharge of consent applications.
Yeah, so this is something that we are continually monitoring. So in a period in which there was a moratorium on spend, the ECU capacity uplift of over twice the amount of personnel in the ECU was the only area in which we were able to spend money because of the demands that you mentioned.
I think I actually started that process.
Thank you.
Correctly.
So the ECU is at more than twice the capacity that it was in order to deal with the demand. We've got also We want to be able to be delivering those consents within a year, and we're certainly on target to be doing that. But you make the point about other statutory consultees as well at Nature Scot. We're also continually monitoring the workload that they have associated with this. Another area that we've put investment into is into the National Planning Hub. The National Planning Hub at the moment is still in the early stages because it's only on hydrogen at the moment, and that was to support expertise and capacity gaps that might exist within local authorities to be able to deal with very, very complex applications that might happen in their space. The idea is that at the moment it's in the hydrogen space, but it could be expanded because a lot of the applications and the resource associated with it is very, very complex. So we want to be able to give assistance to local authorities as well. But the reason for the ECU budget, it's still been in my portfolio, well, there's a number of reasons. Obviously, the Permanent Secretary wants to keep it in the structures that remain, but also the policy associated with the good practice principles and all the policy associated with consents and the development of new policy as a result of movements in the UK government will affect the ECU. The Minister, Ivan McKee, has taken on responsibilities for final consent decisions, but not policy.
Okay, thanks.
Right, I think it's me. Crown Estates. Let's talk about Crown Estates. Scott Wind. The sale of Scott Wind generated about 750 million. And it's all being spent very quickly. How much have you got to help your budget to move and tackle the climate emergency?
In terms of numbers, I might have to go to my officials, but effectively what happened was that we were able to use monies from ScotWind for climate action, not just in my portfolio, but in portfolios associated with climate action as well, like Marie Goujon's portfolio. Thank you. And I have got a note of it. So, in response to finance and local government causes asked for funding to respond to the climate emergency, there was 70 million associated with that. 70 million. No, ScotWind Capital was 52 million, ScotWind Resource was 18 million, a total of 70 million. In terms of my portfolio, supporting offshore wind capital investment, nature restoration, energy and transition funds, there was ScotWind Capital of 179.9 million and ScotWind Resource of 5 million, so that's a total of 184.9. In the Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands, there was progress for transformation and reform of agriculture and food and drink industries, including energy efficiency, improved resilience. There was ScotWind Capital of 30.6 million. And that was in total, that was all in capital. And in transport, there was support for capital investment for sustainable and active travel programmes and low carbon programmes, and that was again only in capital of 78.5 million.
Okay, I'm just doing the maths because my maths are not as quick as they should be. So that's approximately half of the money from ScotWind that has gone back into what you're saying is tackling the climate emergency on the figures you've given me. The other half's already gone in the resource budget, has it not?
Well, I can only speak to what's in my portfolio and the information that I've got there. Obviously, that's maybe something we can write to you. We'll get that information from the Cabinet
well, we see
Secretary
286 million is going in the next 2 years to the resource budget, and some went last year as well.
But I made the argument that climate action and the associated economic benefits that can come from climate action, that it was a right move to use ScotWind money for that.
I think it's a right move to if we're putting up wind turbines out at sea, that money is used to help us develop net zero. It seems to have been about 50% of it seems to have been spent. I'll get the word out in a minute, elsewhere. Mark, you've got some questions.
Yeah, so last week we asked Cabinet Secretary for Transport about how the net zero assessment was working. And she indicated that it is used at early development of policies, but in terms of how it's being rolled out across government, she suggested that yourself would be the best person to answer that question. So,
yes, thank you. Thank you, Fiona.
I'm passing it on. I mean, obviously, Cabinet Secretary, you'll be aware of the long timescale it's taken to get the 3 elements of the joint budget review in place, and the net zero assessment is really the critical bit where we try and understand how climate change is being really embedded into those early decisions about how policies.
So
I'll just leave it to yourself.
Yeah, I think you and I have to take some credit for this when we, in terms of putting forward the argument for the need for a taxonomy to be a sort of climate change taxonomy to be associated with budget spend. Because we obviously had put those to former cabinet secretaries. It's non-statutory, of course, but it's a very useful supporting document of the budget, so that we've got that read across as to where funding in a number of portfolios is contributing to climate action. It sets out how the budget's going to impact on that priority of tackling climate change, and it's divided into 2 parts. An overarching climate narrative highlighting key spending areas from multiple portfolios that contribute towards the response to climate change. And then there's a second part that provides a carbon taxonomy assessment and commentary of the capital and resource budget. So that's work that is always improving, because it's quite nascent work. I mean, I'm not sure if other governments do it. I'm not aware of the UK government doing anything similar. I'd certainly love to see a taxonomy of the UK government's budget as well. And potentially it's something that can be wider fleshed out in the interministerial government groups between all the 4 nations as to how we can assess every government's budget spend in areas, given that we've got the ambition that we have. The net zero assessment has been designed to be proportionate. It operates on a threshold of 10,000 tonnes of CO2 per year minimum, and includes forecast emissions on the impact of policy and options. And if we give annual reports come to me on that, and obviously the outputs of any individual net zero assessments are used internally in the government to ascertain. So I can understand why Ms Hislop, obviously she operates within the net zero assessment for transport and reports back to me, but it's my directorates that collate all of that and do the final taxonomy with finance colleagues.
It would be great to see more of the detail on that, particularly if there's early thinking around capital infrastructure projects or programmes. I mean, it kind of goes back to the conversation we're having on a climate change plan. If that work's being done, then it'd be good to know whether that's being done across the whole of government, with that 10,000 tonne threshold being the trigger for that work.
More detail.
Is it just in transport? Is it in housing? And if there's evidence there and information there, it would be good to see, because clearly climate change isn't the only factor in making a decision. But if it's over that 10,000 threshold, it's being considered. Great. It'd be good to see what the output of that is, so we can actually see what the impact is, positive, negative, whatever policies. Because the taxonomy, all it does is really just puts it into groupings. It doesn't really tell you the extent of the impact of something in a positive or negative way.
I understand that you'd like to see the taxonomy detail broken down. It is for internal purposes, so that we can make decisions on the budget, and there's quite a lot of material that is for internal government. But I do want to say and confirm that it's not just my portfolio of transport, railway, it's across government. It's also in health spend. There's a great deal of work been done in the health space to reduce emissions associated with health spend as well. So it is across government. The taxonomy is at the level of detail that we can provide to the public, but I'm not going to commit to producing any more documents without taking that away, if that's okay. But I can provide more detail on how it's used.
Okay.
I think you've got the next question.
Yeah, it's sort of similar as well, Convener. So, Cabinet Secretary, in your response to the committee pre-budget report, the Scottish Government suggests there will be annual reporting on the outputs from the net zero assessment. So can you say more about when this annual reporting will take place?
So I've really got that annual reports will be made on that. And the next one will be in 2027. I can't possibly give you a date at the moment for a government that isn't in place yet, but it's 2027. But if I've got any more granular detail on exactly when that's planned for, I'll let the committee know.
And can you tell us a bit more of how it will provide us with a sort of deeper understanding on the costs and the benefits of net zero policy when we're scrutinising the budget?
So the emissions, it will have the emissions impact and mitigation reductions of options that are implemented and how that's reflected in the climate change taxonomy. The detail on what that look like, again, if I can write to the committee with the detail on what that looks like so you know what to expect.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for giving it.
Thank you, Douglas. Bob, you've got some questions.
Just very briefly, I think Mark Ruskell exhausted most of the taxonomy questions, which is relatively new for myself. I can take no credit for the development of it, Cabinet Secretary, but I can look at the capital taxonomy in front of me for the budget, and I can see, for example, that £543 million is earmarked as negative high or low expenditure, but £2.9 billion is positive high or low. So you get a breakdown of where the money is going and the impact of it. But of course, there's a narrative around that. There could be essential spend under that negative high category. It could be an essential road safety project that just needs to be done. It could be a resilience matter that just needs to be done. So from my point of view, I was wondering what next for taxonomy and more of a narrative that actually explains, well, you know, sometimes you just have to do things as a government that doesn't always go in the line that you want it to do, which would be positive on the taxonomy front. So more of an understanding for the what next, the narrative around some of that.
That's a very important point, because obviously there's lots of considerations you have to make about what this government spend, and climate change is one of the 4 priorities of government, but it's not the only priority. So if you look at something associated with emissions reduction that had a knock-on effect on child poverty rising as a result of something we did to bring down emissions, then that clearly wouldn't be something that we would want to do. I mean, you need to take everything in the round. And you point to road safety in particular. Look at the dualling of the A9, that is a road safety measure that's been taken because of the catalogue of serious accidents that have taken place in there. So you wouldn't want to only look at the climate taxonomy in relation to everything. Everything has to be taken in context, as you rightly point out.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
I'm just seeing if anyone else has got any questions. Just very quickly, Cabinet Secretary, SEPA's budget this year, how did it compare to last year?
Oh gosh, right. That's where I need to bring Karen in. So this is the quick fire questions as to...
I like them at the end, Cabinet Secretary, just to make sure...
Them, but SEPA, we'll need to get the spreadsheet out.
So, compared with the ABR comparator, SEPA's budget has dropped slightly. It's reduced by 3%. When you compare that against the budget bill for last year, the initial allocation, it's actually increased by 1%. So it's a £1.8 million increase on last year's budget bill in terms of resource, which is particularly looking at setting up the flood advisory service.
But I mean, the evidence that we heard from SEPA during the course of this last year is that our workload is forever increasing. There'll be more stuff for them to do, especially when it comes to climate change and in relation to things such as water abstraction and all of that. And the budget's flat. Are they going to be happy with that? Going to be able to deliver all the things that they've got to do within their portfolio?
Well, we've always got to look at that every year. We always have to take into account what we're asking our public bodies to do and whether they're well resourced to do that.
Well, kind of maybe suggesting to you, with the fact that they still haven't got their computer up and running and they still don't have all the data in front of them and they're being asked to do more and more things, it will seem that it's ever unlikely that they'll be able to deliver.
Meet SEPA on a regular basis, and they can take those issues and we can discuss them when we have those meetings.
I'm sure they'll bring them to you. Mark, did you want a quick question?
3 million per year for Mossmoran for the next 3 years is very welcome. I'm just trying to get a sense, though, of where that sits and whether there are funds within your own portfolio, Cabinet Secretary, that could be used to invest in Mossmoran, whether that's investment in new industry coming to the site or transition funds that the community could benefit from, because it feels at the moment, having been involved in some of the task force meetings of Fife Council and UK Energy Minister and Richard Lockhead, that we're at a point now where investment needs to be crowded into the site, and it could come from different parts of both governments.
Both governments have a responsibility in terms of the future of Mossmoran. The budget line isn't in my portfolio because it's not strictly energy related. The budget line for the Just Transition and the Project Willow spend does, because obviously the refinery is in the energy space. But a lot of the working across Scottish enterprise as a result of the work that's been done in all the many projects, over 100 projects have made representation in terms of Grangemouth. Some of them aren't suitable for the Grangemouth complex, and so we're always looking at other areas of Scotland in which they could be deployed and supported. It's the economy budget that has the 3 million in it, and obviously there's the various fora that you've just talked about that the Deputy First Minister's leading on. But I take your point. There has to be. There's two governments involved here, and there has to be. If I can put bluntly, there has to be a look at the reasons why ExxonMobil decided to make the decision they did, and their commentary on the fiscal setup that prompted that decision.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all your answers. Quite a marathon session for you, Cabinet Secretary, this morning. The good news is that the committee's work will continue and will continue on beyond this as we move into private session. We therefore move into private session. Thank you.